Chapter 1295. Enrich dissuade. This is a decisive battle. The Empire has invested so many troops in the south, but Her Majesty has never told us. What did she say? At least 1/3 of the Empire's military strength is here. Enrich clenched his fist and growled. If these legions are gathered together, what about Fanzon and Cruz? Look over there. Tarkus walked up and pointed in a direction. The flag of the dead moon. Madara's future star suddenly felt dizzy. Her Majesty the Emperor. Brando pursed his lips tightly. This was undoubtedly a decisive battle, and Erwin's greatest enemy, the Empire of the Dead Moon, was about to be defeated in this battle. However, he did not feel a trace of joy in his heart, only a deep fear. He looked at the sea that shone with purple light, and looked at the Somir crystals that fell from the clouds. His heart was cold. Was this a battle between the undead and the crystal cluster? The scale of this battle had already surpassed the Battle of the Oblique Forest in his previous life, and the Cipher War in the Year of the Sparks. Only the battle in the Alkash Mountains before his time travel could be comparable to this. However, the Empire of the Dead Moon, which was so powerful that it seemed to be invincible, actually lost in such a crucial battle. In his eyes, the flags that represented the legions were disappearing in the sea. That represented not only the defeat of the undead, but also the withered petals of the Roman Black Rose. If Madara lost 1/3 of its military strength here, then it was still unknown whether the Empire could maintain itself. Needless to say, would the crystal cluster stop their march to the north because of this? It was very difficult to say what was going on. Brando could not help but ask himself. He did not know if the Empire of the Dead Moon had also experienced such a tragic battle in the south in his previous life. At that time, the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon was a forbidden zone for players. His Majesty the Emperor had forbidden any northern nobles from entering the south. Naturally, it was the same for players. No one knew whether the war in the south of the Empire was intense or mild, whether it was a local conflict or an all-out war. Brando could not remember whether the Emperor was in the realm of eternal death when the War of the Black Rose broke out. This was the tragedy of Erwin. The war in Erwin did not even attract the attention of the Emperor. This is the war between the world of order and dusk. Brando, no one can stay out of this. White mist jumped down from Medish's shoulder and landed beside his feet, watching this scene. Brando turned around and found that everyone seemed to be under a spell as they stared blankly at this scene. Some of them came from the 9 Phoenixes, which had a powerful empire behind them. Some came from Rubik, which was a desert kingdom. Although it was not as glorious as Kurlutz and Madara, it had a long history. There were also some who came from his territory, from the small country of Awin. Other than Medisa, most of them had never seen such a magnificent war in their lives. Although Delphine had witnessed the battle between the Empire and Hazel's army of constructs in the Grey Hills, she had never seen such a magnificent war before. However, that battle took place in the Grey Hills, and the battlefield was less than 10 kilometers wide. Compared to the battle in front of them, it was like a child's play. Even Brando's eyes reflected this battle, and his heart was surging. The Holy War 60 years ago seemed to be reappearing in front of his eyes. The might of the Dead Moon Empire had exceeded everyone's expectations. The 8 massive legions almost made the Kurlutz feel ashamed, not to mention that this was only 1/3 of their total strength. Of course, due to various reasons, the undead had never been able to gather their full strength. The Dark Lords fought with each other. If it were not for the appearance of the Mercury Staff, this powerful and rare kingdom would have almost gone into obscurity forever. However, those who were not involved in it always indulged in the past glory of the Empire, such as Delphine and Brando. They never thought that outside the human world, there was a power that was not inferior to the 4 holy cathedrals in the slightest. That was the Black Rose of the Roman Tour. Except for Brando, no one knew this secret. It was not that they could not understand it, but because arrogance and pride blinded most people's eyes. But now, this powerful enemy was being crushed by an army that was completely unfamiliar to this world. Its enemies seemed to have no intelligence. They only knew how to swarm forward and swallow everything, and then the Empire of the Dead Moon was defeated. It was a complete and utter defeat. Everyone heard the sound of something being broken. It was the countdown of the original order being overturned, and the destruction of the civilized world by the power of disorder and chaos. Adeline seemed to have thought of something, and her face turned pale. Insursta and Tarkus did not say a word. The former was still clenching his fists. Huang Hua bit her lower lip, and Mr. Lu's face was solemn. Brando had a solemn and pensive look. But at this moment, a few spots of light suddenly flashed in the sky, and a few intertwined golden lines extended from nowhere, instantly penetrating the entire battlefield. In the middle of the clouds was Leviathan. When Brando raised his head in shock, the dazzling flames had already exploded in mid-air in the middle of the battlefield. It was like a flare brighter than the sun. A few roaring fireballs burned fiercely in the sky of the battlefield, and the dazzling light made the light of the entire battlefield dim, as if the day had turned into night in an instant. But the phenomenon only appeared for a moment. The mushroom cloud had risen with endless smoke and dust, and the shock wave pushed the dust cloud forward, rushing into the forest with a whoosh. Then, tons of dust and debris swept over. Brando reacted quickly. He stretched out his hand and pushed it forward, opening up a net of spatial laws, blocking all the dust and air waves outside. But even so, the light shield was still bent at a terrible degree, and the impact was far greater than the impact of the crystal clusters on it previously. "What's the matter?" someone shouted in the roar of the explosion. But the noise drowned out his question, and at the same time drowned out the answers of others. But a thought flashed through Brando's mind. Was there a third party on the battlefield? Was it Madara's backup force, or was it an ally of the undead? He looked back at Insursta, but the latter and Tarkus had the same blank look on their faces. They had never seen such an offensive and means before. Was this magic? Brando felt that it was a little familiar. He wondered if the Bugis had participated in the battle. For the Silver Folk, this was very likely, because after all, their opponent was the Twilight Dragon. The smoke and dust soon dissipated. Immediately, someone screamed, "Look over there." Brando looked in that direction and saw that the horizon was shrouded in clouds, and a white mist hundreds of feet high rose. In that mist, there seemed to be thousands of troops gathering. Those were the lost names. The direction they were in, Brando's heart tightened slightly. He saw rows of lost names knights, armed with spears, dressed in armor, and riding warhorses made of clouds and mist, coming out of the depths of the mist. They were in formation. The knights of the lost names were expressionless and silent. A lost names knight in a cloak and a laurel crown on his head rode past the knight on the left and right. He held his long sword high, and the translucent tip of the sword seemed to reflect the light of the sun. "That's King Eric." Blank suddenly shouted in shock. Brando also saw it. It was the Lionheart sword. That scene seemed to overlap with what had happened 1,000 years ago. On the plain, the flags were shining, and the knights wore long helmets and held spears. They lined up against each other, facing the heavy cavalry of the Cruz people. The man in front of them shouted to them, "Eruin people, my knights, are you afraid?" There was only one answer. "They're here again, your majesty." A pale, slender hand slowly lowered a long staff flowing with silver light. She looked at the battlefield in silence. "Those are our heroes sleeping in the long river of history. The sages have long passed away, but they still protect us. Isaac, do you still think we are the only ones facing this war alone?" "But I don't understand, your majesty, who are they?" The Most High with the Mercury staff opened her mouth slightly and said the name in an almost inaudible voice, "The Earth Legion." Rows of pale white knights were walking out of the clouds. Their spears were raised high like a forest, and the tip of the spear was shining with a dazzling light. In their memories from 1,000 years ago, the only answer lingered in their minds like a ghost. What was the answer? The war horses began to accelerate and trotted on the battlefield. The knights held their heads high and put down the tip of their spears in rows. A white wave appeared on the battlefield. They surged, wrapped in the momentum of thousands of soldiers and horses. These knights' faces were blurred, and their bodies were illusory. Each face represented a distant memory when they were alive. The past, present, and future were intertwined in their eyes. They had no names, lost their nationality, and no longer belonged to any nation or race. Everything in their life, together with their past, seemed to have passed away like smoke. And everything that was left. They only existed for this answer. The defeated left wing of the undead stopped instantly. A blade that emitted the light of Baileng appeared on the battlefield. It swept across the vast land and cut diagonally into the purple sea. It collided with a loud bang. At that moment, Brando turned around. "We will also join the war." "My lord, what did you say?" Medisha asked in surprise. "Madara can't lose this war," Brando said to Medisha, "just like the decisive battle on the Great Plains that humans can't lose. Odin gave us a choice, and now we must give him an answer." This answer had been waiting for 1,000 years. It was a long time. But the four sages finally returned everything to the hands of the people who should decide it. At that moment, Brando suddenly understood the meaning of the Most High Holy. 9. The hermit. The rusty spring was being reset. Chapter 1296. Brando turned around and looked at the others in the wind that was filled with the smell of gunpowder. Just like Madara, the nine-headed phoenix has fought against monsters for a long time, and we have lost countless of our loved ones. No matter what, teacher, I am willing to fight against them. She took a deep breath and tried her best to calm herself down. She opened her mouth and replied, just like Madara, the nine-headed phoenix has also fought against monsters for a long time. Fang Chi walked up. Count. You want the sacred jade sword back? Brendel saw through his thoughts with a single sentence. But our strength is insignificant. It's okay, I need a promise from you. Phantom Chariot is a man of his word. Even if it's about the mystery of the emerald. Fang Chi hesitated for a moment, gritted his teeth and nodded. A green jade sword suddenly appeared in Brando's hand. He turned the tip of the sword and handed it over. I hope you won't disappoint me, Mr. Fang Chi. Fang Chi's pale hand grasped the hilt of the green jade sword. Quill grabbed Adni's shoulder as she was about to rush up. Adni struggled and shouted anxiously, this is a chance for him to return the omniscient eye to us. Quill, what are you doing? The elven ranger looked at her and shook his head silently. This is not a chance, Adni. Does the omniscient eye really belong to us? But you and I are not its owner. We are just people who carry it. The omniscient eye stayed in the desert kingdom because it chose Lubic. It is the same now, then what do we do? What about our mission? Have you forgotten the teachings of RA? Of course not. That's enough. Quill let go of her shoulder. Wisdom is the power of silence. We must always see the road ahead and know who our enemies and friends are. Follow him. He is right. Madara cannot lose this war. Humph. Adni snorted. She pulled out her sword, turned around, and pointed the bright sword to the sky. Knights of Ra's wings, no. I mean my colleagues of the Sunflower Mercenary Group, draw your swords and let's go. What is the Sunflower Mercenary Group? God knows. Don't doubt the vice captain's naming ability. Did you know that her first cat was called Grayley? Grayley's daughter was called Whitey, and Whitey's son was called Blackie. What about the dark-skinned son or daughter? No, there was one time when the deputy commander didn't hold it as tightly as he did when he was bringing it out. It ran away like it was flying and never came back. That's really sad. The knight could not help but laugh as he pulled out his long sword while talking and laughing. The wind carried the conversation of the Rubik's people to Brando's ears. He looked in that direction. It was the Knights of Ra's wings. No wonder the quality of these knights was so high. That was Rubik's Knights of the Holy Temple. They were the core force that guarded the Sun Temple. Their status was similar to Cruz's Flame Knight, but their numbers were less than half of Flame's. Mr. Blank, Brando said, I'll leave Miss Magadal to you. It might be difficult to take care of her on the battlefield. Blank nodded. Medisha, I'll leave the rest to you. The Silver Elf Princess nodded silently. She raised her right hand, and a shining silver card spun in her palm, and finally turned into a long horn. The long sound of the horn echoed throughout the battlefield. Whose horn is that? She turned her head and looked at the officials. Maybe it's their horn. For the past few days, they haven't sounded their horn. Why would they suddenly sound it today? This. We don't quite understand, Your Majesty. Then go and find out. Yes, Your Majesty. She turned around, her black robe flowing across the marble platform like water. The scepter in her pale hand was flowing with a mercury-like luster. Her pale face did not seem to have the emotions of a living person. It was cold, indifferent, and unhurried. The undead regained their footing, and the white fog was eroding the entire battlefield. Thousands of knights lined up in a long line, like an invisible blade cutting into the army of the crystal cluster. When the knight collided with the crystal cluster, there was no sound. There was neither a shout nor the sound of metal colliding. It was like a silent image, a replay of the scene from 1,000 years ago. The illusory knight passed directly by the crystal cluster like a ghost. But the image returned to normal in the next moment. The surface of the crystal cluster that came into contact with the lost names quickly lost its color, became dim, and then shattered into colorless and transparent crystal fragments. This invisible blade swept across the left wing of the battlefield, and the crystal cluster army there immediately collapsed. A huge gap appeared on the battlefield, as if as long as the undead seized this opportunity, they could turn defeat into victory and win the battle in one fell swoop. But the 7 undead legions were powerless. The enemy, at least 20 times their number, was firmly nailing every bit of the undead's reserve forces in place. The crystal cluster's work was disorderly, but effective. Like their opponents, they were not afraid of death. The black eyes of the person holding the mercury staff were cold. She did not give any orders, as if this battle, which concerned the survival of the Roman Black Rose, had nothing to do with her. But everyone understood that at this point in the war, the rest was up to fate. If the dead moon still cared for everyone. Woo, woo, woo. The long sound of the horn sounded again. Andrea and her colleagues were coming out of a crystal forest, and the battle of the entire Finhodo Strait was presented before these 122 war goddesses. In the southern part of the inner sea of the Dead Moon, there was no landmark named Finhodos, and the reason why this place was called the Strait was because it was located between the Calm Sea and the Lunar Sea. The names of these two seas were said to come from an ancient inheritance, and the only land protruding from the sea between them could be called the Strait. Outside the elemental frontier, there was no real sea. Even if there was seawater, it had long been exhausted by the frenzied magic that escaped in the tens of thousands of years of war. This was a world without life. But there was hope in silence, and it was because of its existence that Wonde was like a baby in swaddling clothes, nurturing life and the future in its sleep. The mothers gave the two to the two worlds. As the elder brother, it was his duty to protect this world. The people who were born here never regretted it, because they believed that one day, the support from their grown brother would completely rewrite this war. That was the only hope of this world. This world was called Magritos, which meant the frontier. This was the frontier of civilization. Andrea looked at everything on the battlefield, and for a moment, thousands of memories appeared in her mind. Most of these memories didn't come from her, but from the last moments of countless ancestors who had sacrificed themselves on the battlefield. Their experiences and hopes were engraved in the hearts of all the descendants. One day, the people we protect from another world will come here from the other side of the door. The power of the growing civilization will ultimately obtain victory in the eternal war. We can't hold on any longer. Day after day, year after year, where are they? Have we been abandoned, Lady Martha? I don't want to die. Andrea, I'm in pain. They're here, Andrea said softly, sisters. Although they were still weak, the seed of hope had been planted. One day, it would grow into a towering tree. In this way, this war had a meaning. Andrea turned around. Sisters, prepare for battle. The heroic spirits can't hold on for long. The key is to tell everyone that the Earth Legion is still fighting. She put on her helmet. Everyone did the same thing and put on their helmets. The helmet was very different from the wound. It didn't have a metallic luster on the surface. Instead, it looked more like a crystal mask. It was dark and reflected a dark green light. Rows of data flowed down from the black crystal mask like a waterfall and reflected in Andrea's eyes. Then, it merged into one and formed a spinning mark of Tiamat. Requesting high-level agreement authorization, connecting to the battlefield, requesting battlefield data link, loading Tiamat system. Authority, goddess of war. 120 people raised their heads slightly at the same time. A bright silver mark appeared on their foreheads. Flying mode. Andrea's voice reached the ears of all her companions through the telepathic communication system. Only the will couldn't be destroyed. On the battlefield at dusk, telepathic communication was the safest way to transmit information. Legend had it that this was a system developed by the divine people and planeswalkers. 122 wings of light stretched out from their backs at the same time. Requesting Nucleus 14 to drop weapons, ambush configuration, Andrea looked up. In the sky, 3 huge spots of light appeared above the clouds. They were 3 magic arrays formed by crisscrossing lines of law. They corresponded to the stars of the Dragon of War, Tiamat. The huge magic array rotated like a gear. Every time it rotated, it swept away the thick clouds. Beams of light fell from the sky and landed in various positions on the battlefield. Andrea raised her hand, and a beam of light immediately appeared in her hand. The beam of light condensed into a pitch-black blade in a few seconds. Then, the beam of light fell on her body. A streamlined armor immediately covered her body. Get ready to go. She shouted in a low voice. Wait, there's a higher authority on the battlefield. Suddenly, someone cried out in alarm. There was panic in the communication channel. For the first time in 1,600 years, the footprints of the divine people appeared outside the elemental frontier again. Andrea suppressed the shock in her heart. She whispered to her companions. Don't panic. Lock onto his position and ask who he is. Is it Gaia's will? Or is it the truth? Andrea. The voice in the communication channel was almost crying. His authority is too high. The system told us that we can't request it. Oh my God, look at that mark. That is. No. He's not the first generation. That's Martha above the divine people. 7,000 years later. The divine people returned to Wound. Chapter 1297. The lost names suddenly stopped on the battlefield. The pale knights were looking back, and tens of thousands of eyes were cast to the rear of the battlefield. Rows of illusory knights stood in place, as if silently waiting for something. What's the matter? The supreme of the undead was slightly startled. She saw pillars of light connecting heaven and earth, distributed throughout the battlefield. A new force had intervened in the battle. Who was it? Everyone mounted their horses. Brando raised his sword, and the golden light of Odorfice shone with a strange light in the sun. 1,000 years ago, mortals fought for their fate under this sword. 1,000 years later, it became a flag again, and this time, it would rewrite the fate of Wonde. Medisha, raise our banner and tell the world that this is the battle of Erewhon's people. Victory! The knights shouted in unison and burst down from the high ground at the edge of the forest. At this moment, Erewhon's people, Rubik's people, Nine Phoenix's people, Rosaline's people, even Fang Chi and his men. Everyone no longer had any other thoughts, only to fight and win. And if they failed, it would be nothing more than being buried on the battlefield. For these people, death was not worth mentioning. Every single one of them was proud. Fight for honor. Fight for victory. The little silver elf princess looked up and threw out a silver card. The card flipped in the air, turned into a beam of light, and shot straight up into the sky. Then the clouds parted left and right, and a ray of light fell from the sky, shining on everyone's head. May I be honored, and then I can honor you. Medisha held a spear and shouted, eternal song of reincarnation, gently waving on the battlefield. Knights, encouragement dash, light armor emerged from her body, and a stream of light went up against the spears held tightly by the knights, turning into a brilliant silver flag at the tip of the spear. On the flag, the silver crescent moon and lily were dazzling beyond compare. Above the sky, a golden eye slowly opened, and she looked at the ground with a thoughtful expression. Planeswalker, I didn't think there would be planeswalkers in this world. That's good, then the inheritance won't be severed. Light swords descended from above the clouds and pierced straight into the ground. Brando took the lead, and light followed him. The mystical horse he was sitting on seemed to be stepping on clouds, galloping as if it was flying. The holy sword Odorfice in its hand was pointed forward, reflecting a burning golden line under the sunlight. The golden line was cutting into the gap between the crystal cluster and the lost names. The multicolored light descending from the clouds also advanced, plowing into the great army of crystal clusters. Cavalry. The undead lords who were commanding on the high ground saw this scene very clearly and were shocked. Who is that? Look at their banners, they're displaying their banners. That is, silver new moon and lily flag. What flag is that? Did one of the lords in the south join the war? They turned around and looked at the woman holding the Mercury staff behind them. But the monarch of the undead did not say a word. At this moment, this sudden cavalry became the last reserve force of the undead, and under the command of 2 people, it hit the most critical place on the battlefield. The cavalry was ready, and the glory was inspiring. Incersta felt as if he had returned to before the age of 18, when he was still a human and had not transformed into what he was now. There was still blood in his heart, and he was full of hope to give everything for the rising of the dead moon. The reason of the undead gave him and Tarkus an excellent combination, but the enthusiasm of the early years in his heart was long gone. The rise of the Empire had become a cold and step-by-step process, and the reason why the undead had a tendency to self-destruction may have stemmed from such contradictory feelings. No undead was willing to fight side by side with the living, let alone such a motley army from all over the world. That kind of complicated feelings maintained their existence. Disgust, calmness, and a certain goal. For the new generation of Madara, only eternal death was the arrival of some kind of peace. But at this moment, he seemed to feel his beating heart and the majestic pulsing blood. He looked back at Tarkus and saw the same color in his eyes. What was going on? Everyone's morale was at its peak, and they could not help but look forward. Brando's back on the horse seemed to be crowned with an invisible halo. It was a pair of wings made of light, and it infected everyone. Perhaps it was not impossible to die in this battle. His second thought was that the Silver Elf Princess had a keen sense of the battlefield, and she was not inferior to him in the slightest. Both of them had found the weakest point on the battlefield at the first moment. But it was not enough. Brando raised his head and looked at the purple wall in front of him that was getting closer and closer. He withdrew his sword, and a golden halo bounced off from his body, suddenly enveloping everyone around him. The knight crashed into it in an instant. Immerse let out an ear-piercing shriek. Other than Magadol and Delphine, he could be said to be the weakest in the group. Even Phoenix Fire's combat skills were better than his by at least 3 points. He wasn't an undead lord who would charge into battle in the first place. But even so, he was not afraid because of this. The emotions of the dead were indifferent, and their understanding of existence and death was very different from that of the living. He screamed because of the hysteria in his heart. I have to kill at least one, he thought to himself. He was also very clear about the strength of these crystal clusters. On this battlefield, the crystal clusters that appeared were far stronger than the monsters around Rosaline. Their average strength was almost above the elemental awakening. But even so, he saw a crystal cluster raise its sickle-like claws towards him. The future star of Madara closed his eyes subconsciously, almost thinking about how he could minimize the damage. He did not expect to be able to avoid it. The opponent's movements were much faster than his. And at this moment, he felt the spear in his hand respond with a solid touch. I stabbed it. The spear seemed to have stabbed into tofu, and without any resistance, it lifted the crystal armor on the surface of the crystal cluster and stabbed directly into it. The monster let out a scream and swept its claws towards him. Immerse's eyes widened as he saw the claws hit his chest heavily, then twisted, deformed, and shattered into countless scattered crystal fragments, which scattered in all directions. This, conflict halo. Blank whispered, such a high-level conflict halo, master is a Templar Knight master. Immerse was stunned, and he rushed straight over, thinking in his heart, isn't he a grand sword master? Brando and his knight were like a hammer, smashing heavily into the purple sea, and all the crystal clusters that dared to block them were immediately turned into dust. The group of knights who were originally elemental knights, together with the cavalry equipment, the buffs of inspiration and the conflict halo, had now become an unstoppable blade, cutting a path through the swarm of crystal clusters. Medisha. Brando suddenly reined in the reins, turned around, and faced the army of crystal clusters that were rushing towards them. He stretched out the holy sword Odorfice and swept forward, and a golden sword light flew forward. The golden line extended to hundreds of feet in an instant on the battlefield, and wherever it passed, the crystal clusters were cut in half. After passing through as many as 7 or 8 layers, the crystal clusters in front were all shorter, like a sickle sweeping through wheat stubble. Medisha understood tacitly, and she understood that the Lord was buying time for her. She pointed her spear to the sky and shouted, Heaven's armor. Thousands of silver lines fell from the sky. Each line was connected to a crystal cluster on the ground. Medisha swung her spear from top to bottom. Countless light pillars fell from the clouds along this silver line, and flames burned from the top of the heads. Those crystal clusters had no resistance at all, and were already turned into ashes. The front was suddenly empty. The undead lords were already stunned. Fanzin's people. When did they come here? While the lower-level lords were in a daze, the higher-level lords did not waste any time. This was because the sudden appearance of the cavalry cut through the gap between the Madara's undead and the Crystal Cluster army, causing the enemy's attack to pause for a moment. At least the flanks of 3 legions were thus freed. The Supreme with the Mercury staff decisively gave an order, and she pointed forward with the staff in her hand. Cooperate with them, attack. But we need the bone dragons, more bone dragons, your majesty. Then go and find them. Bezes, don't tell me the reason, I only want the answer. If you can't do it, I will let someone who can do it replace you. she replied coldly. A few minutes later, tens of thousands of bone vultures flew from Madara's position, and they were not inferior to the Crystal Cluster Army's power in the sky. Unfortunately, they were too little of a threat to the Crystal Cluster Army. As soon as they took to the sky, they fell down like rain. Everyone knew that the undead's air force would not last long. Brando suddenly stopped. "There's a fluctuation of magic," White Mist whispered on his shoulder. "What's that?" Someone was screaming. Brando looked up. In mid-air, Leviathan was turning around. It was slightly injured earlier, but it was not worth mentioning for its huge body. It let out a piercing scream above the clouds, and countless crystal clusters swooped down from mid-air as if they had received an order. Their attack was unusually simple, and they fell directly into the undead army's camp like a rainstorm. In the blink of an eye, the undead army's front line was broken into pieces. But this was not what really made him look solemn. Above the clouds, a dense mass of black dots suddenly appeared. They passed by the Crystal Cluster Army, and in an instant, they were above the battlefield. At a distance of more than 10 miles, Brando could see the true colors of these black dots at a glance. Isaac, who was standing behind the Most High, put down the monocular in his hand with a solemn expression. He quietly held the brass casing of the magic device, and his hands were a little pale. Unlike the other undead creatures present, he was a human, and a necromancer with a very high position in the kingdom of the Dead Moon. But unlike the liches who yearned for immortality, the human necromancers always had the various weaknesses of their kind. Weak, timid, greedy for life, greedy for power, as if they were not worth mentioning in this highly efficient kingdom. But in fact, it was these people who supported the reform of the undead transformation. He was on this battlefield to see with his own eyes the extent to which the new alchemy could improve the newly born undead creatures. The experiment went smoothly. But at this moment, Isaac did not feel the slightest bit of joy in his heart. "It's a horseshoe worm." His voice was a little distorted. Chapter 1298. Isaac's words did not seem to attract the slightest attention. A little flame flickered in her dark eyes. The sea of bones, black flags, and purple crystal clusters covered the sky like a tide. Lightning fell from the clouds, and one or two flames streaked across the sky. The distant scene of the battlefield was reflected in the depths of this pair of emotionless and cold eyes. She turned around. She stretched out a pale and slender finger, holding the mercury staff in her hand, and pointed in one direction. There was no order. However, behind her, the undead lords all pressed their bony palms to their chests, and the soul fire in their chests burned fiercely. The dark nobles lowered their heads like the tide, and ripples spread from front to back. They turned around, and pale flames flickered in their eye sockets. The Madara generals in the last row understood and turned around. They opened their hollow jaws and waved their white bony fists at the necromancers and undead wizard apprentices as they roared angrily. "Let those cowards from Balakirivo enter the field, and tell them, for the eternal rest of the dead, long live the Black Rose of Brahmanto. The Black Rose will never wither." The sound of the command came one after another on the battlefield. The low-level liches and undead wizard apprentices hurriedly ran back, and some even fell to the ground on the way. But under the supervision of the undead supervisors, these unlucky fellows immediately got up on their hands and feet and ran to the few huge crystal towers behind the high platform. Groups of liches and undead wizard apprentices placed their hands on the crystal towers, and green ripples immediately extended along the spindle-shaped main crystal of the crystal towers, which was 20 to 30 meters tall. When it reached the top of the tower supported by the white bone base, it immediately turned into beams of green light and shot out in all directions. The green line connected to the other direction of the distant battlefield, and when it hit the crystal tower in that direction, the nearby sea of bones immediately lit up with green spots of light. Almost all the liches looked down at the sparkling emeralds inlaid on the bone staff in their hands. When they looked up again, rows of skeleton soldiers began to slowly turn around, and on the entire battlefield, it was as if a huge wall had formed in an instant. The Bonefire Legion has entered the south of the Lorwade Hills. The Death Vulture Knight is ready to join the battle. Pale Knight, prepare to join the battle. Black Plague Legion, prepare for the next wave of attack. The undead were adjusting their attacks. Beams of green light crisscrossed in the air above the battlefield, instantly forming a dark green net above the undead army. But the good times did not last long. There was a commotion in the tide-like cluster of crystals. Suddenly, a large number of behemoths with mountain-sized clusters of crystals on their backs emerged. The moment they appeared, they immediately raised their heads and let out ear-piercing shrieks. The crystal beams on their backs vibrated at a high frequency, and the resonance of the sound waves spread out at a speed visible to the naked eye. At the front line of the undead army, the smaller crystal towers began to crack and crumble. Further away, the green beams of light began to become disorderly. In the sea of bones, the green spots of light began to disappear one by one. It was as if the entire battlefield had darkened in an instant. Change the flag signal, idiots. Her ice-cold eyes reflected this scene, but she didn't seem to be surprised at all. However, the undead lords behind her had already turned around and roared at their subordinates. Black sword-shaped flags were erected on the battlefield. Erwin's knight was still moving forward, as if to separate a path in the sea of crystal clusters. Insursta looked back at the direction of Madara's army. His dark eyes were full of dark clouds, and the black flags reflected a thick shadow in the depths of his pupils. My lord, we have to find a way to get rid of those strange things. He couldn't help but shout anxiously. What did you call me, Mr. Insursta? Brando asked as he looked at the huge monsters that suddenly appeared in the crystal clusters. Occasionally, one or two crystal clusters would pounce on them, but he didn't even look at them and cut off their heads with his sword. As long as you can help Madara win this war, I'll work for you, as long as you don't mind having a dark noble as your retainer. Insursta gritted his teeth and said loudly. Tarkus split the head of a crystal cluster with his sword. He looked back and wanted to say something, but after thinking for a while, he shook his head and didn't speak. Brando looked back at him and said with some surprise, I had an undead retainer in the Cruz Empire. You're not the first, Mr. Insursta. But can you represent the will of the Mercury Staff? The Dark Nobles are free, not just our will. Brando urged his horse forward and shook his head. Your proposal is very tempting, Mr. Insursta. But I don't want to threaten anyone. If you're willing to come to the ABs to work for me, I'll welcome you. But for now, let's think about how to win first. He said loudly, help me count how many there are. Don't miss any. Insursta opened his mouth wide and stared blankly at Brando. The reason he said those words was that he was full of pride. Just like Brando firmly believed that the Black Lord would become the future of Madara, Insursta also knew his own value. He was a genius. He never denied this and was proud of it. Even if it was the rumored Tariq, he never felt that he was inferior to him. He was the pride of the Pale Rose, the first noble to complete the dark transformation before the age of 18 in 100 years in the central region of the Sea of the Dead Moon. Even his deputy, Tarkus, who was praised by everyone, could only stand behind him. He was very clear that the human in front of him was definitely aware of his value. He had long discovered that the other party's understanding of him was even more thorough than his own. Without a doubt, this Count was also an outstanding person, and only a stupid person would be jealous of a virtuous person. Those who were truly above others would only use them for themselves. Are you in a daze, Mr. Insursta? Brando tilted his head and said, this is a battle for your country. I thought you didn't want to give this glory to Medisha. I'm sorry. Insursta immediately raised his head. His somewhat panicked gaze swept across the battlefield. They are in the east and west. There are a total of 27, no, 28. 29. Tarkus remained silent as he answered. He pointed out the new crystal monsters that appeared on the battlefield one by one, and then looked back at his partner. Insursta's face alternated between red and white. Brando did not look at the two of them. Medisha, help me count. He raised his hand and opened his 5 fingers slightly. Space, without warning, a huge crystal cluster that was screaming suddenly flew up from the sea of crystals. It was still waving its limbs in panic, obviously not understanding what had happened for a moment. Then the second one, the third one, the fourth one by one, the crystal clusters were called out, and then rose from the sea of crystal clusters. Far behind the undead army, the undead lords who were about to use flag signals to give orders suddenly froze. They turned around one after another and looked at this scene, dumbfounded. Only that pair of pitch-black eyes still did not have a trace of emotion. This is... Someone is helping us. Someone suddenly shouted in a low voice. 27, 28, 29, but when the last giant crystal cluster rose into the sky, there was a sudden commotion among the crystal clusters. This commotion spread out in all directions like water ripples. The woman on the high platform turned around and faced all her subjects with a cold expression. The undead lord seemed to have woken up from a dream. Quick, don't waste time, attack them. They gave orders at the top of their lungs. The undead's crystal tower became bright once again. Mr. Insursta, go and contact your majesty. You know what we need. Brando raised his right hand, and the 29 giant crystal clusters were fixed in the air by him like toys. He said to Insursta with a calm expression. Medisha also looked at the future Black Lord of Madara. Adni and her knight looked at Brando as if he was a god. Just by looking at the 29 monsters that could not move in his hand, they could understand what kind of great power it was. Quill's eyes were full of light. My lord, Insursta answered a little awkwardly. Now is not the time to discuss this, Mr. Insursta. Only how to win is what we need to consider. Brendel shook his head. Even he was a little surprised. He thought that he could at most lift 2/3 of them, and that would be good enough. But at this moment, he felt that a strange way of thinking dominated his current state. He seemed to be looking at himself from a higher dimension. The power of the laws in his body was restless. The traditional knowledge of time and space seemed to be leaving him. The point was, after the battle with Rushta, he felt the power of the elemental orb again. And this time, they were more powerful, so majestic that it seemed to shock the mind. He resisted the shock on the spiritual level and said to Insursta word by word, I know you can contact your majesty. Hurry up. Insursta nodded silently, but then shook his head. I'm sorry, my lord. You're right. But I don't think we need to contact his majesty. The liches of Balakirivo are already entering the field. He said in a sincere tone and turned back. Brando followed his gaze and turned his head. There was a continuous flash of light on the ground line. Chapter 1299. Rows of wizards wrapped in black robes were entering from the back of the undead army. There were hundreds and thousands of them. Compared to the fiery front line, the scene here was strangely silent. These white bone claws stretched out from under the sleeves of the robes and held the magic staffs in their hands. The magic staffs were completely different from the simple bone staffs in the hands of the necromancers. They were made of dark metal, like the metal of the underworld that could connect the two worlds in the legends. On the top of the magic staffs, the king's tear glowed. This was the first undead magic army from Balakirivo, the army of liches that shocked the world in the Battle of Cypher. In the wild wind on the battlefield, a skeletal hand lifted the hood of a cloak, revealing a pale skull underneath. The dark red light in Victor's eye socket stared at the sky above the battlefield. Madara, the black rose of the Roman Empire, was withering. Rows of wizards in the same black robes walked to his side and stood side by side with him, forming a long line on the battlefield. A silent battle line. But Madara, all things must wither, all things must sleep forever. Martha above, everything is so consistent with the law and common sense. The king of liches, the ruler of Balakirivo, Victor raised the bone staff in his hand. The king of jewels, the Prometheus diamond unearthed from the sea of the dead moon, emitted a dim light in the wind. The undead lost the sky and the freedom to fly, but they still had magic. Death was still enough to engulf everything. Eternal darkness, it uttered a monotonous word from its dry throat. All things die, everyone said in unison. One by one, magic circles unfolded on the horizon. They rotated, as if they were opening a door of light that shone faintly. A ray of green light rose from the horizon and was reflected in the depths of Brendel's eyes. It seemed to draw a long parabola from the distant horizon, turning into a stream of light as it approached from afar. Everyone turned their heads subconsciously. The green beam of light left a long afterimage in his field of vision. Right in the middle of the sea of crystal clusters, it exploded with a loud bang. It was like a plague flower that was emitting a dark green light had bloomed. The crystal clusters were lifted up by the huge shockwave and were thrown into the air before falling down like raindrops. Careful, this is a test shot. Insersta shouted. As if to fulfill his words, a green curtain of light gradually rose from the horizon. They were like countless suns rising into the sky. They arrived in the blink of an eye. It fell on the crystal cluster's position like a rainstorm. The 29 giant crystal clusters instantly turned into fine powder. The green streams of light smashed into the sea of crystal clusters one after another. Every time they landed, a huge gap would be blasted open in the dense purple sea. In almost an instant, the crystal clusters had no choice but to retreat. This was the first time they had retreated since the start of the battle. Frank was so excited that he felt as if he had returned to the Holy War 60 years ago. He did not seem to care about the death magic that was flying over his head. He shouted to everyone, "Sir, the undead are covering us. This is our chance. Where is the opportunity?" Brando asked in a loud voice as well. "Go around to the flank of the crystal clusters." Medisha looked around and immediately replied, "After the undead's magic is over, the crystal clusters will organize a new attack. Then it will be time for us to play a role." Frank gave the little silver elf princess a thumbs up from the back of his horse. "What do you think?" Brando looked at Insersta. "That is, if the Black Plague Legion can withstand it." Insersta nodded as well. Brando could not ignore the opinions of the three top commanders. He looked up and quickly chose a route in the chaotic battlefield. The silver crescent and lily flag moved on the battlefield once again. There was finally a hint of admiration in the depths of the dark eyes that watched the battlefield. She nodded. "Is the Black Plague Legion in place?" "They are in place, Your Majesty." "But what about the Air Force?" Isaac looked worriedly at the army of crystal clusters above his head. The beetles had almost flown to the sky above the battlefield, and the huge monster in the clouds was also slowly moving in this direction. She looked up at the sky with a gloomy expression, but then lowered her long eyelashes and said, "Don't worry about them." Rows of Crusader executioners with heavy shields walked out from the sea of skeleton soldiers. They came to the front line and lined up in rows. Soon, they formed a solid three-layered defense line on the battlefield. The necromancers looked out through the gaps between the shields of these huge undead heavy infantry. Beams of green light were falling from that direction, and the light of the explosions was endless. A huge gap appeared on the battlefield. On the left wing of the Black Plague Legion, thousands of pale knights emitting fluorescent light were moving in a roundabout way. They raised their hands. The necromancers in the back immediately turned around and threw out communication spells. These spells were gathered by the frontline commanders, and the low-level necromancers used their communication crystals to transmit the information to the nearest crystal tower, which then converged it to the command center of the entire battlefield. The Black Plague Legion was in place. Prepare for the second wave of impact. The second wave of attack has arrived. At the moment when the spells of the Lich Legion ended, the purple tide formed by the crystal clusters swept over again. They spread across the gap on the battlefield in a few seconds and crashed in this direction. This time, it was not the four-legged arthropod-like crystal clusters that were charging at the forefront. Instead, it was the crystal cluster beetles that were thick and strong but had a low center of gravity. They were the attackers recorded by the undead. These crystal clusters with extremely high explosive power had always been the backbone of the crystal cluster army. Prepare for the attack. They are expected to arrive in 5 minutes. The necromancers quickly gave out orders one after another. But to everyone's surprise, the first ones to arrive were not the charging crystal clusters, but the beetles in the sky. The beetle army finally flew over the undead army at this moment. They let out a piercing shriek and immediately began to dive into Madara's position. The beetles opened their claws and teeth, cutting into the undead formation like a sharp blade. Almost in an instant, the front of the Black Plague Legion was shaken. Erwin's silver-white flag broke out of the encirclement at this moment. The flag circled around the right wing of the Crystal Cluster army and came back from the direction of the hills. Blank looked at the scene with a solemn expression. It's over. The monster's advantage in the air is too obvious. The undead can't hold on for much longer. There must be a chance, Insursta said loudly. Is there still a chance? Brando pulled the reins and turned around to ask. Medisa froze for a moment. What's wrong with you, Medisha? No, nothing. Medisha's expression was a little strange. My lord, what are you going to do? There is still a chance. Brando narrowed his eyes and replied, if I can stop the attack of the Crystal Cluster army in the front, Insursta, Medisha, can you find a chance? What did you say, Mr. Brando? Adney questioned loudly. We can't do that. It's not us, it's me. Brando turned around and asked solemnly, what will happen? Everyone was stunned. Blank gulped and replied, if the undead can draw out a fresh army, the undead can draw out a fresh army. Medisha suddenly reacted at this time. Her silver eyes flashed with an inexplicable light. My lord, if you can do it, we can win this war. Medisha. My lord, please leave the command of the battlefield to Mr. Insursta. I believe he can do it well, Medisha replied firmly. Brando glanced at the silver elf princess. Their eyes met as if their hearts were connected. Then I'll leave it to you. Lady Delphian. Delphian looked up at him. Protect yourself. The Prime Minister's daughter was slightly stunned. Her eyes flashed with an inexplicable light. Brando turned around and held Odorfice in his hand. With his back facing them, he said, Mr. Insursta, don't let us down. He clamped the horse's belly and made the warhorse speed up. He leaned back slightly and rushed to the center of the battlefield. My lord. Insursta looked at the other person's back in disbelief. He muttered, you really made me look at you in a new light, Mr. Insursta, Medisha reminded him. Miss Medisa, Insursta knew that the silver elf princess was Medisa's confidant, so he turned around and solemnly said to her, I hope we can work together happily from now on. We will fight side by side. No, the little princess shook her head and smiled. This war belongs to you, Mr. Insursta. It doesn't belong to me. The future Black Lord of Madara was stunned. The pale undead army, the dark land, and the purple crystal ocean. The three colors intertwined under the sky and slowly approached each other. Spears were being lowered in rows. The undead soldiers knew no fear. Only the flames of eternal death were dancing in the depths of their eyes. Lightning shuttled through the clouds. Meteorites were falling from the distant sky with long tails of flames. But in between the two distinct colors, a human knight appeared at this moment. A man, a horse, and a long sword shining with golden light, pierced between the undead army and the waves of crystal clusters. Who is that? The undead lords were in a panic. Their panicked voices rose and fell one after another. Her dark eyes reflected the figure of the man standing upright on the horse. The wind blew his long hair and fluttered in the air. She pursed her lips and held the mercury staff tightly in her pale hand. She didn't say a word. She recognized that person. Everything in the prophecy. Brando tightened the reins of the horse. He turned the horse's head and blocked between the undead army and the waves of crystal clusters. Behind the rows of undead heavy infantrymen who were retreating under the attack of the horseshoe beetles, countless liches and necromancers looked at this scene at a loss. Why was there a human here? What was he doing here? Was he crazy? But Brando's back was facing them. In his eyes, a purple line appeared on the horizon in front of him. It covered the entire battlefield and was rapidly becoming clearer. In the torrent, there were monsters baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. He also wanted to ask himself if he was crazy, but a clear voice in his heart told him that he could do it. Because in his body, the voice of the law was resonating. It was the power of time, space, and the whole world. They were intertwined with each other. That was the power of existence. The power of the elemental orb had completely resonated. Brando raised his hand. A continuous silver network suddenly appeared above the clouds. This network spread from front to back and covered the entire battlefield in a flash. Everyone looked up in shock. The bright network was reflected in their eyes. The power of the sage. There was a soft bang. The mercury staff fell on the high platform. P.S. It's the 23rd. Please vote next month, everyone. Chapter 1300. The cold wind was like a line, passing through the battlefield. The gravel was like smoke across the dark ground. The collar of the count's coat swayed in one direction. A hand pressed it down and straightened it. The purple jade marrow button reflected a thin line in the sky. Brando was like a straight spear on the horse's back, facing all of this. The big earthquake rumbled. The small stone pieces moved horizontally on the solid ground. The light in the sky gradually dimmed. The setting sun was burning, emitting the last trace of heat. A silver network stretched out from the clouds behind him, over his head, and stretched forward. Silver pulses of light cascaded forward, connected to each other, grid by grid, glittering. The wind blew his long hair. The dark brown hair swept across his cheeks, strand by strand. Brando's expression was calm, as if he was standing and listening to a distant song. That song was like a gust of wind that traveled tens of thousands of miles across the battlefield, carrying with it countless ideals and countless memories. Thousands of voices, overlapping each other, thousands of wills, converged into one. Clouds and mist walked on the battlefield. The illusory night stopped. Their blurry faces seemed to have a gaze, watching one end of the battlefield. In every corner of the battlefield, 27 ancient kings with laurel crowns on their heads turned their heads. They held their swords in their hands, but they all cast their gazes in one direction. The Lionheart sword shone brightly. 780 years ago, a team of knight arrived at today's Grey Mane Valley. A man held his sword in front of the knight and said, "I swear by my sword, Erwin will bear the glory, sweep away all oppression and injustice. My people, my subjects, will follow the oath of the sages and walk along this path. If one day, the glory abandons us, this sword will no longer protect this country." 1,600 years ago, a flag was slowly raised on the battlefield of the Great Plains, reflecting the first rays of the dawn of that day. Then why are we fighting? Night, people of Cruz, my brothers, for victory, for the future, for tomorrow, for our descendants, no longer living under the shadow of the Myrnas. What we need is not charity, men, tell me, what do we need? The king holding the golden flame blade listened attentively. A long wind blew through the clouds. The migratory bird spread its wings, making a rustling sound. 990 years ago, the Mist Elves established a country in the Supreme Court. This everlasting forest will be our kingdom from now on. Elves, we have traveled thousands of miles just to find this everlasting land. We were born here, and we will sleep here. From now on, there will be no more wars. An epoch ago, two great wills met above the clouds. Dusk, this era is different, the future will no longer belong to you and us. The knight raised his spear and made an oath. A speck of green light appeared in the sky, as resplendent as the sunset. Then, thousands upon thousands of voices resounded in his mind, creating a cacophony of noise. Then, why should we give up our authority? Can you be sure of the consequences of failure? What is Martha doing? This is the last time we'll give in, restart the world. I'm sorry, we failed, Brando closed his eyes. Listen, this is the voice of the sages. The struggles of countless generations, the blood and sacrifice of countless generations, those that were recorded in history, and those that were forgotten by history. The long river flowed, like the sparkling light on the river, every memory fragment was like the flow of an epic. And there was an ultimate answer to all of this. When Brando opened his eyes again, the silver grid was reflected in the depths of his eyes, like a silver flame, burning fiercely. He looked up, his gaze seemed to be able to penetrate the clouds, seeing the rows of arrays outside the wound world. Countless rays of light were hanging down from these satellites, penetrating the clouds and falling to the ground. The entire battlefield seemed to be divided by the silver line. This is the law of Tiamat. Time and space, energy and mass, at this time and place, there is no distinction between them. What is the ultimate power in this world? Existence. Countless people have sacrificed countless lives to achieve all of this. It is so that we can exist in this world, so that civilization and order can continue to exist, so that our ideals and beliefs can continue to shine. So, a voice said softly, we have no reason to retreat. A translucent female figure seemed to be projected from the clouds, landing beside Brando. Her figure moved slightly, as if she would disappear at any time. Lady Tiamat, perhaps I should call you Martha. Me? Martha. Not even close, that is not a power that I can seize, it does not belong to me. The woman smiled and shook her head. So, all of this was arranged by you. Who exactly are you? Brando felt the power resonating in his body. If he still did not understand what was going on at this moment, he would have wasted his life's experience. He asked softly. Haku looked at him and mouthed 3 words. The ultimate saint. Then, why? You still don't have an answer in your heart. Haku turned around, looking at the approaching crystal cluster army, and answered. What kind of power is this? Brando raised his head and looked at the silver pillars of light descending from the sky, penetrating the clouds like raindrops, and falling on the horizon. This is the power of the entire world. This world was formed by it, and was born for it. It is what the Twilight Dragon has been searching for, the truth of the world, but unfortunately, it only belongs to the true king. The true king, who are you talking about? Haku looked at him and shook his head. Maybe it is you, but not really. But maybe one day, you will get that key. So, take the opportunity now, and feel it well. This may be the last thing I can do for you. Brando did not understand the meaning behind this sentence. He took a deep breath, the tremors of the earth becoming more and more obvious. The crystal cluster army was almost in front of him. He raised his head and stared at the battlefield in front of him. At that moment, it was as if thousands of wills were added to him, countless voices lingering and echoing in his mind, converging into a sentence. This is our power, our country, our civilization, our history. This is time and space, the sharp blade given to us by God. This is Amber, the sword that changes fate. One day, it will backtrack everything, change everything. Take a step forward, our successor, our king. We will personally crown you. Put on the laurel crown, bathe in the mountains, take over this power, and end all of this, fate and chains. Brando raised his 5 fingers and gently pushed. Directly opposite the Black Plague army, the entire army facing the Crystal Cluster army. With a loud bang, millions of crystal clusters left the ground, struggling helplessly in midair. There was a moment of dead silence on the battlefield. Outside Won's atmosphere, in the array that was arranged like a star ring, the surface of tens of millions of satellites burst out bright light belts, emitting intense light and operating wildly. A bright river of light hung upside down in the sky above the entire world. It stretched across the sky, like a flowing Milky Way, emitting bright light. At that moment, the entire world resonated, and a voice seemed to reverberate in the depths of the world. The scepter of truth was slowly descending from the sky above the world. It was held tightly in Brando's hand. Her Majesty the Queen of Madara even forgot to pick up her Mercury staff. The Death Lords did not notice their monarch's loss of composure at all. Adeline covered her mouth in disbelief. Tarkus tightened the reins, looking at this scene with a complicated expression. Martha, above. The knight squeezed out these few words from the depths of their throats. Behind everyone, Medisha looked at this scene in high spirits, her eyes full of deep admiration. But she glanced at her companions, turned her horse around, and galloped in one direction without looking back. Attack, attack. Among the Death Lords, someone asked dryly. Insertus suddenly turned his head. Where are the reinforcements? Where are the reinforcements? He asked sternly. The Crystal Cluster Army's frontal attack was really stopped by that person alone, and a huge gap appeared in their front line. He suddenly realized that at this time, as long as there was a fresh force that could insert into this weak point on the battlefield from the flank, then this war would be settled. But, where were the reinforcements? The Black Plague Army. No, they were not enough. He and Brando turned their heads at the same time to look for Medisha's figure, but there was no trace of the Silver Elf Princess. Insersta and the Marshal looked at each other. The wind on the battlefield suddenly became stronger. Brando turned his head, his messy hair almost covering his eyes and blurring his vision, but he did not speak in silence. He was just waiting for the arrival of the fresh force that Medisha had mentioned. He believed in this Silver Elf Princess as much as he believed in himself. He knew that Medisha would never lie to him. He was waiting quietly. But there was not much time left for him. Above his head, the galaxy was still shining brightly. Tiamat's projection was beside him, his expression unchanged. The wind became wild. The wind that swept across the battlefield seemed to come out of nowhere. In the camp of the undead, the black flags were suddenly raised high one by one, flapping loudly. In the blink of an eye, it was a sea of flags. The airflow swept up the gravel, like a dust storm, sweeping across the entire battlefield. The Death Wizards and Liches raised their heads. The Death Lords and the Death Lords turned their heads back at the same time. In their throbbing soulfire eyes, the fluttering black rose flags were reflected, but there was a trace of doubt in the depths of their eyes. Where did this wind come from? Chapter 1301. The wind came from the hills in the west. There was a legend that was often spread among the bards who traveled all over the place. The wind blew, and the giant beasts walked in the sky. And the wind was the sound of their wings flapping. What is that? A necromancer suddenly screamed. It was 4 long, intersecting silver lines. They were like 4 dazzling sharp swords that streaked across the sky of the entire battlefield in an instant. Wherever they passed, the crystal clusters and locusts in the sky fell like raindrops. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads and looked at the silver lines that extended forward. They drew an arc at the end of their vision and flew back. This time, they could see clearly that it was a vigorous giant dragon. But on their slender necks, not only were there giant dragon horns on their huge heads, there was also a single horn that was straight forward. Dragon, no, that is, knights in silver armor sat on long saddles, one in front and one behind. The knight in front held a 5-meter-long shuttle-shaped spear, and the knight behind held a huge shield. Their faces were completely covered under the silver armor. Exquisite and mysterious patterns were engraved on the metal, cold and arrogant. It was as if they were describing the most glorious identity that belonged to them 1,000 years ago. Silver Elf Guards, Dragon King Cavalry. They raised their spears high. Varler. The Dragon Knight shouted in unison. Varler. The cry of victory resounded through the sky. Behind them, silver dots of light flickered in the sky like stars, appearing on the eastern horizon. Silver Elves. The undead lords could not believe it. Martha above, those are silver elves. It was a silver torrent that was sweeping down from the top of the Lorwade Hills. It was countless heavy night. Their snow-silver armor shone under the setting sun, and the snow-white feathers on the top of their helmets rose and fell like waves. The silver double-ended swords in their hands and the elven longbows on their backs proved the identity of the knight. They had defeated the Myrnas, the natives, the witches, and the undead army in Veloka. Their glory was recorded on the metal on their chests. It was a cross between a spear and a sword. The sword belonged to Frost Singer Cinna, while the spear belonged to a hero. That hero. She used to be their princess. They were the Soderkra Heavy Cavalry, the Lingu Army, the pride of the elves. 1,000 years later, after the War of the Holy Saints, the Silver Elves finally returned to this land for the sake of this war that no one could stay out of. Above everyone's heads, the dragons began to accelerate and plunged into the sky above the battlefield. A small figure was riding a warhorse towards the Silver Elves' heavy cavalry. Medisha's long hair fluttered in the wind. The mystical horse she was riding was getting closer and closer to the charging Silver Elves. When the two formed a parallel line, she suddenly raised her head, raised her spear and shouted, Slaver Klarvarler. Victory to the holy land of Soa. The silver elven knight turned around and looked at her. Their eyes showed a trace of doubt, but then this doubt turned into ecstasy. They raised their swords and placed them in front of their chests. That was the highest etiquette of the silver elven warriors. That was wordless trust. It was the highest form of respect for a hero. The little princess smiled, her heart full of pride. Illusions intertwined in front of her, as if she had returned to 1,000 years ago, in that dreamy war. That was the war of mortals against fate. They won everything. At this moment, the heroes and warriors had once again returned to fight for the sacred oath. She raised the spear in her hand and shouted with all her might, Long live the Holy Silver Valley! Long live the Holy Silver Valley! The Knight Army of the Holy Song Army responded in unison. Their voices resounded on the battlefield like thunder. Knights of Soderkra. Medisha's long hair fluttered in the wind. She waved her spear forward, Follow me. Long live your highness! The entire heavy knight regiment immediately drew a beautiful arc on the battlefield. From top to bottom, from the regiment commander to the captain, there was not a single person who objected. It was as if this was how it should be, 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 as if this was how it should be. Because she was Medisha, the most legendary army commander in the history of the Lingu army. She was the hero of the elves, a heroic spirit sleeping in the ancient temple. Medisha emerged into the vanguard of the heavy cavalry army. It was as if she was holding a bright blade in her hand. This blade had been in her hand 1,000 years ago, and it was the same at this moment. It mercilessly stabbed into the throat of the Crystal Army. At the most appropriate moment, Brando raised his head and looked at the army with relief. There seemed to be a flame burning in his heart. That was Medisha's promise to him. He knew that she would definitely keep it. He let go of his hand. Countless crystal clusters fell from the sky and landed heavily on the ground, causing the entire battlefield to shake. Insursta looked at the elven army that surged past him and could not help but sigh. Even in terms of military talent, he found that he was still slightly inferior to the princess beside that person. Launch the counterattack. He and a ruler of the undead far away on the other side of the battlefield gave this order at the same time. Insursta raised his long sword and led Adni and her knight down from the hills. Her Majesty the Queen lowered her head and picked up the Mercury staff. Her dark eyes finally showed a hint of relief at this moment. Silver elves, you did not fail to keep your promise. The crystal cluster's attack was collapsing. They began to retreat from the entire battlefield, leaving the battle line one by one. The various armies of the undead immediately raised black flags that represented pursuit, regrouped, and threw themselves into the pursuit again. Looking down from the sky above the entire battlefield, in an instant, the battlefield that spanned tens of kilometers began to show signs of being one-sided. The last to retreat was the Crystal Cluster's air force. Under the cover of Leviathan's huge body, they calmly retreated to the south of the battlefield. The Silver Elven Dragon King Knight immediately went up to entangle them, but a few White Dragon King Knights were like mosquitoes beside Leviathan. They could not pose any threat to it at all. Brando knew that if he let this thing leave so easily, this battle would be far from over. And on this battlefield, only he had the ability to make it stay. Almost immediately, he rose into the air and flew in that direction. But it was at this moment that a black shadow overtook him from behind. Brando was slightly stunned, thinking that it was fast. He looked up and found that it was a silver-haired girl who overtook him. She obviously did not look like an undead. She wore a very strange armor. The style of the armor was very different from the traditional style of wound. The surface was full of streamlined lines, and the material seemed to be metal, but the surface was full of crystal lattice networks. It seemed more similar to the remains of the gods he saw in the deadly frost forest. Andrea turned her head and looked at Brando with a shocked expression, but she did not intend to say much. She only remembered the young man's face deeply and then continued to fly forward. Freya. Brando was shocked when he saw the face of the other side. Although the silver-haired girl's mask covered the upper half of her face, the lower half of her face and the Valkyrie mark on her forehead were very similar to Freya's. Needless to say, the 3 pairs of light wings on her back were Freya's Valkyrie armament. But Andrea turned a deaf ear to his shouts. She began to accelerate in mid-air, and soon other Valkyries appeared in the sky. They flew to Leviathan above the clouds and then threw black balls forward. Those black balls rotated in the sky and soon fixed in place, suspended in mid-air. A ring-shaped red light beam appeared on their surface and then connected with each other, locking the mountain-like Leviathan in a red light net. Coordinates confirmed. Andrea called out, "Lord Dragon King, please descend, Dragon King." Brando was stunned, wondering if the dragon god Bahamut still existed in this world. But before he had time to question this guess in his heart, he heard a cold snort from the sky. A dazzling golden eye opened above the clouds. Then, a pair of wings that covered the sky appeared. It was a dragon. Its size was actually not inferior to Leviathan, who was cruising in the sky. As soon as it appeared, it pressed its claw towards Leviathan's head. The huge claw seemed to be able to tear the clouds apart as it clawed towards the horn on Leviathan's head. The shadow of the claw swept across the ground, causing the sky above the battlefield to darken. Leviathan let out a roar. It swung its body, obviously unwilling to give in. But unfortunately, silver spots of light flashed on the dragon's claws. Brando was so frightened that he almost cried out. He saw that those were not silver spots of light, but bright silver cards. These cards rotated in mid-air and then gathered into one. A cold voice came out of the dragon's mouth. Deliver the final blade. A black shadow that spanned across the sky swept across Leviathan's huge body. Leviathan let out a shrill scream, and its huge body was cut in two. The broken part turned into countless crystal fragments and slowly fell from the sky. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Brendel silently counted the number of horns on the dragon's head that peeked out from the clouds. There were exactly 7 of them, no more, no less. In this world, only one dragon had 7 horns. That was the legendary lover of Odin. That was the evil dragon king, the teacher of the death hound of the Rubik Desert, Orglaith. Players called her Master Craftsman, the 7 Dragon King, Fuchsia. But she was actually a planeswalker. P.S. Begging for votes. Writing is so tiring, I'm rolling on the ground. Chapter 1302. Leviathan's mountain-like corpse stood on the horizon, reflecting the blood-red sun. Dusk clouds hung low, and a few crystal clusters hovered above it, making their last stand. On the battlefield, the battle was nearing its end. Looking down from the sky, the silver torrent representing the elven army of Quellenar's Holy Silver Valley and the black army of the undead Moon Empire were divided into 4 groups, chasing after the remaining purple parts on the black ground from all directions. The crystal clusters were torn apart, scattering into the fog in all directions. In the sky, black warships were entering the battlefield. Those ghost-like floating warships appeared in the sky like shadows. Space was distorted on a large scale, and in the distortion, these warships turned into solid entities. Your Majesty, our fleet has entered the battlefield. Humph, the Supreme One holding the Mercury staff coldly snorted, but there wasn't a single trace of emotion in his pitch-black eyes. Everyone, or rather the undead, knew that Lich Dai Lin definitely had ulterior motives. Tell Dalen that I came just in time. Tell him to prepare for battle. Isaac was stunned, and quickly lowered his head, but Your Majesty, the battle is nearing its end. The woman turned around and inadvertently glanced at him. This glance made Isaac feel as if he had fallen into an ice cave, as if his thoughts had been completely seen through by the other party. This necromancer trembled in fear and hurriedly lowered his head. I understand, Your Majesty. What do you understand, Isaac? She pointed her snow-white index finger at the battlefield and asked, is there only one enemy left for the undead Moon Empire? The Queen's tone was casual, but the undead lords looked at each other. Brando descended from the sky. The undead's fleet entered the battlefield and dealt the final blow to the crystal clusters and the beetles. With the presence of the goddess of war and the 7 dragons king, there was no need for him to interfere in the battle in the sky. When he landed on the ground, he immediately saw Delphine's anxious face. He couldn't help but be a little surprised. He wondered when this woman had become so concerned about him. He knew that her obedience these days was just a disguise, but the look on her face didn't seem to be fake. However, the first to greet him wasn't the Prime Minister's daughter, but Insursta. Mr. Brando, please leave this place immediately. This is a map of the east side of the Sea of the Dead Moon. You can take the shortest route to Erewhon if you follow the map. If that doesn't work, you can go to Lubeck and take a boat from Lubeck to Erewhon. It's much more convenient than Nine Phoenix. The future star of Madara said to Brando as soon as he saw him. He took out a crystal from his arms. Brando recognized it as a messaging crystal at a glance. Anyone with a little bit of magical ability liked to use this messaging crystal to record messages. What's wrong? Brando was stunned. His Majesty the Emperor of Madara may want to harm you, my lord. The Prime Minister's daughter frowned and said, after the undead's fleet entered the battlefield, the situation has become unfavorable for us. Even if the Silver Elves are on our side, we are still at a disadvantage. Besides, the Silver Elves may not be willing to stand up for us, even if Metasha is their princess. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He immediately realized that it was possible. He recalled the behavior of this supreme undead in the game. No matter how he looked at it, she was definitely not a merciful or indecisive person. If she recognized his identity, she might really attack him, even if it was just to make her attack on Erwin more successful. How dare she? Adeline was in disbelief. The Dragon Queen is still in the sky. Will she sit by and watch the undead betray their allies? Delphian shook her head. She did not agree with the naive commander's opinion. The seven-pole Dragon Queen, Fuchsia, was an ally of the undead in history. Don't forget the relationship between the undead and the Myrnas. Even if we take a step back, with her status, it is unlikely that she will interfere in the affairs of the mortal world. This is completely different from the war with the crystal. The Prime Minister's daughter's mind was clear, and she immediately understood the underlying relationship. Brendel also understood that even though he did not know what role the Nameless Ones and Fuchsia played in this war, it was hard to say if they would intervene in the mortal world's war. He also wouldn't place his hopes on an illusory possibility. Insursta hurriedly nodded. Mr. Brando, Delphian is right. Her Majesty is determined to get Erwin. She has also heard of your performance in the First War of the Black Roses. Coupled with your previous performance, she may have already given the order to attack you. Mr. Brando, he advised earnestly. You have extraordinary skills. It will not be difficult for you to take Miss Adeline and the others away from here. There is really no need to fight the Imperial fleet. If I'm not wrong, the commanders of the 7 legions and their retainers mean that the Empire has at least 10 Supreme-class elites here. No matter how strong you are, after dealing with them, how will you fight the undead army? Brando could not help but look at Insursta with some surprise. Do you know what you are doing, Mr. Insursta? Of course I do. But the Dark Nobles must keep their promises, Mr. Brando. Besides, I don't want to see you clash with the Empire, especially now. Brando looked up. Thank you, Insursta, but it may be a little too late now. Insursta turned his head, and his expression changed slightly. He cursed inwardly because he saw that the Death Moon Empire's fleet in the sky was changing their formation, but it was not a pursuit formation. Instead, it was a beautiful arc battle line. It was obvious that Lich Dalen, who commanded the fleet, intended to besiege them. In fact, on the battlefield on the ground, the various undead armies were also rushing back. They quickly gathered from several directions and surrounded Brando and the others in the middle of the battlefield. Mr. Brando. Do you want me to talk to Her Majesty? Perhaps she will change her attitude on account of your help to the Empire. Insursta was afraid that Brando would suddenly attack. The scene of Brando blocking the Crystal Cluster Legion alone had left a deep impression in his heart. The Empire might be able to keep him, but they would definitely pay a terrible price. However, the threat of the Crystal Cluster was far from over. They had won one war, but what about the next? Insursta was puzzled. Why couldn't Her Majesty see through this? Come to think of it, the Empire seemed to have some kind of obsession with a small place like Erwin. Although Erwin's strategic position was important, it was not to the point where it was on the same level as the future life and death of the Roman Tuo's Black Rose. He subconsciously looked at his partner, the vampire Tarkus. He knew that he had always been weak in politics, otherwise he would not have been sent to a place like Rosaline. His deputy, who was born in an ancient and prominent blood clan family in the south, was far more talented in this area than he was. Tarkus remained silent, only silently shaking his head. Delphian, who had been frowning, happened to see this scene. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have grasped some clues from it. She narrowed her eyes slightly and a light flashed in her light purple eyes. "Call me Lord, Insersta." Brando looked around and took in the mobilization of the spirits. Everyone around him looked solemn. Adney and her knight were ready for battle again. The elf ranger Nookwell also took out an arrow, but when he touched the quiver behind him, he could not help but frown. After the previous battle, there were not many arrows left. The Knights of Ra's Wings were the elites of the Kingdom of Rubik. Adney naturally did not want to lose them in a foreign land, let alone fight for a stranger. But now, she did not say a word, because in her heart, she had long believed that Brando was the messenger of the sun god Ra. If he was not the messenger of Ra, how could he have the power of a sage? Was the so-called sage not a demigod of mortals? Hearing Brando's words, Insersta was slightly stunned. He raised his head and looked at Brando in shock, not quite understanding what he meant. Brando replied, "From now on, you are my retainer." This was a break. Insersta smiled bitterly. He did not expect that the fragile alliance between Erwin and Madara would only last for such a short time on the battlefield. Perhaps this alliance was one-sided in the first place. The Count had helped Madara out of the spirit of an ancient noble, but Her Majesty had never approved of this. The battle had just ended, and she was going to attack Erwin's people. As a member of the spirits, he could understand the thoughts of the Supreme One with the Mercury staff, but at this moment, he found it difficult to agree. "My lord," he sighed, "I can pledge my loyalty to you. Through the fog to the west, we can reach Somia. Let's break out in that direction. You don't want me to clash with the Empire." Brando understood what he was implying. "My lord, you know very well that this war is not just a war between the spirits and the Crystal Cluster. If..." Brando looked at the army of the undead that was coming from all directions. At this moment, the sky was getting dark, and the sky in the east was faintly purple. Stars twinkled above the clouds, and under the night sky, the dark army was dancing with the light of countless soul flames. He replied, "I understand what you said, but you don't quite understand Your Majesty's painstaking efforts." Insersta was slightly stunned. He raised his head and looked at him, not quite understanding the meaning of this sentence for a moment. Above the clouds, the undead fleets were still moving about. Fuchsia was observing everything that was happening on the ground through her golden eyes. Bramato's Black Rose's actions did not escape her eyes. She snorted coldly and said in a disdainful tone, "That's right. Humph, little girl." Chapter 1303. In the fog, the changes on the battlefield were so fast that it was hard to understand. The undead legion that was chasing after the Crystal Cluster had surrounded their original allies. Coincidentally, the Black Plague Legion that had escaped because of Brando was now facing off against Medish's Linga guards. Of course, they were no match for the Silver Elves. However, there were 3 other legions on the left and right of the Black Plague Legion that were closely monitoring the Silver Elves' every move. The undead legion's floating fleet lined up in mid-air, but they did not dare to act rashly. Right in front of them was the Silver Elves' Dragon King cavalry. There were only a few hundred of them, but their illustrious reputation in history was enough to make any floating fleet tremble in fear. Lich Dai Lin clearly didn't plan on losing more than half of his forces here. Brando's team was behind the Elven Knight. There were now 2 Silver Elves in the team. One of them was naturally Medisha, while the other was the commander of the Silver Elf Solakad Knight Squad. Speaking of which, Brando had met Solakad once on the battlefield in Ampere Seal. Counting the time at Chablis, this was the 3rd time he had met Solakad. Coincidentally, the situation was similar every time. In Ampere Seal, he used the Elven token to ask the Silver Elves for help. In Chablis, the Silver Elves also happened to help him. Although it was because of Medisha, it was almost the same this time. If the Silver Elves did not come to the rescue, he and the undead legion would not have anything to do. There would only be an uncountable number of crystal clusters left on the battlefield. My lord, we meet again. Most of the elves were handsome, and the silver elves were even more so. Back in Chablis, the commander of the Phoenix Guards, Nalathar, was a super handsome man. Now, the commander of the Night Squad was not to be outdone. Brando did not have the strength to be jealous of this natural genetic advantage. He could only smile bitterly. Lord Commander, your presence here makes me feel very pressured. A lot of pressure. Although the Silver Elf Knight did not quite understand the meaning of this sentence in human language, it did not prevent him from understanding Brando's joke and smiling warmly. I'm very sorry. Of course, this was a joke. Neither of them took it seriously. Brando raised his head and looked at the sky. What do you plan to do next? That's up to Sir Lord. You guys should leave. It seems that if I don't satisfy her, that Emperor won't let this matter rest. The Silver Elf Knight looked at him and asked, Have you decided? Brando nodded. The latter bowed slightly and looked at Medisha. Your Highness. I want to stay by the Lord's side. But everyone misses you, Your Highness. I'm already very satisfied to be able to fight side by side with everyone after 1,000 years. I don't dare to ask for more. You should go back. The current Medisha is no longer the princess from 1,000 years ago. I'm only the Lord's retainer. I have the duty to stay here and fight side by side with him. Medisha smiled and replied. The Silver Elf Knight sighed and nodded. Then, Lord Commander, I hope that we can fight side by side on the real battlefield. Definitely. By the way, send my regards to Nalathar. The last time I went back to Chablis, they were no longer there. Brando replied. All the Silver Elves have returned to Holy Silver Valley. We have to make long-term preparations for the upcoming war. The Silver Elf replied, But I will send your regards to him. May the light of the stars and moon always shine on your head. May the light of the stars and moon always be with you. The Silver Elves are retreating. The undead lord saw the movement of Lin Ji's guards from afar. The Dragon Knight in the sky also turned around. Although they were not afraid of fighting the Silver Elves were still a force to be reckoned with after the War of the Holy Saints. If there was a choice, there were not many who would be willing to face them. The undead lords heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed that the Silver Elves were not willing to fight against Madara for a few mere humans. After all, they should know that only the Empire of the Dead Moon could fight against Twilight with them. Erwin's position in this war was destined not to be in the position of a small kingdom. But amidst the sighs of relief, the pair of cold and indifferent eyes did not have a trace of joy. She turned around and coldly looked at her retainers. Isaac, come with me. The undead army quickly parted to form a path. Brando squinted his eyes. The first thing he saw was the Mercury Staff, and then the person holding the Mercury Staff. The other party was similar to what he remembered, the Emperor of the Dead Moon Empire. Although she should be younger in this era than in history, it did not make much difference to the undead wizards. Her appearance was maintained at the age of 27 or 28, with a very rare head of long black hair and eyes. It was said that Her Majesty the Queen had the blood of the Myrnas, and there was also a saying that she was a descendant of Odin. There was no expression on the Queen's face. This was different from the majesty and arrogance of the Silver Queen Constance. This Supreme of the Undead was purely indifferent, although there were players who privately called her the Queen of Facial Paralysis. But in Brando's memory, this Supreme rarely showed any external emotions. She was like a precise machine, ruling the Empire with harsh means. To be honest, he thought that the other party would order an attack without saying anything. The fact that she could appear in front of him was already somewhat beyond his expectations. Enrich the dragon, Tarkus. The Supreme of the Undead spoke first, but not to Brando, but to the two people beside him. Beside Brando, Blanche's face was instantly filled with anger. Princess Magadol also frowned. Although in terms of status, Brando was far from the Emperor of Madara, but at this moment on the battlefield, the two of them were actually equal in terms of status. Not to mention, Brando's previous display of strength should be enough to win the respect of any ruler of the empire. Perhaps others did not understand the concept of a subordinate dying when the ruler was humiliated, but as a former marshal of the allied armies who was familiar with the rules of the game between nobles, Blanche obviously understood that this woman was showing her contempt for them. For the same reason, Magadol also felt that something was wrong. But Brando did not care. He was still sizing up this legendary monarch. In his previous life, there were only a few people who could see Her Majesty in person. Most of the players' understanding of her came from rare videos and images, as well as some official promotional videos. Speaking of which, this was the first time he met her face to face. "Your Majesty, we are now the Count's prisoners." Tarkus looked at his colleague and calmly replied. Insurste could not help but feel a little grateful. He knew that if he were to answer, he would not be able to lie to the Supreme Emperor. But if he did, he would not be able to avoid the problem of his current status. The Dark Nobles kept their promises. Although he was not afraid to fulfill his promise, he also understood that it was not a wise thing to reveal this issue at this time. Sure enough, once Tarkus spoke, the Queen of Madara turned her gaze to Brando. This time, her tone was even colder. "I know who you are, human. I will give you a chance. Submit to me, and you can get everything you want." "Everything I want." The woman looked at him coldly. Her gaze was like a cold blade, and no one dared to look at her directly. Brando also frowned subconsciously. He had a strong will. Although he was not afraid, he still felt a little overwhelmed. According to history, this queen was a gifted monarch of Madara. It was as if she was born with the Mercury staff. He originally thought that it was a little exaggerated, but now he realized that it was not entirely true. In this world, there was actually someone with such a strong will. It was even slightly stronger than him. Only such a person could control the power of darkness. Although the dark elemental orb and the scepter were powerful, it was always a heavy burden for anyone who received them. If one's will was not strong enough, it would easily corrupt them, just like those witches who were corrupted by the dark magic and became crazy. Even though Brendel did not refute her words, the Supreme One with the Mercury staff understood what he meant from the latter's words. "This is your answer." Brando suddenly found it funny. He thought that life was like a play, and it was all about acting. This woman looked cold on the surface as if she did not care about anything, but if there was an Oscar in this world, she could easily win a movie queen or something. He nodded. The latter looked at him deeply and turned to leave. The undead army immediately gathered behind her. Brando looked in that direction and suddenly said to himself, "It seems that your queen's ambition is bigger than I thought. If there is a chance, she will definitely get rid of me and Dalen together." As he spoke, he looked back. The next moment, Haku's shadow appeared beside him again. "Sister!" Medisha shouted in surprise. Haku's shadow looked back at her and pretended to be disdainful. She looked straight ahead and said, "If you can't even do this, you deserve to die here. I'm surrounded by an army of undead, Lady Tiamas. You're the one who threw us into this place, right? What else can we do other than watch a show for free?" Brendel retorted in annoyance. "There's also the nature orb and the Mercury staff," Haku replied, "those are also your goals. Then what do you want me to use to fight with this queen? Don't you already have a card up your sleeve, Count?" Haku glanced at him disdainfully. Chapter 1304. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Adney didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. The members of the Ra's feathered knights stood on either side of her, their swords pointed outwards as they faced off against the black mass of undead more than 100 meters away. The heavily armored crusader executioners lowered their spears in rows. Their joints creaked as they collided with each other. The blades reflected the last ray of sunlight below the horizon, and the blades glowed with an obsidian-like luster. Huang Hua sat on her horse, her hand moving to the hilt of her sword. Mr. Willow stood by her side, protecting her. Not far away, Blank and Metashow were ready to break out of the encirclement. The Phantom Chariot's genius swordsman, Fang Qi, seemed to be hesitating. The two elders beside him had grim expressions. Insursta was the only one who kept looking up at the sky. He frowned as if he had thought of something. Not a single crystal cluster could be seen on the battlefield. The horseshoe beetles in the sky had long since disappeared. However, the Strait of Finhodos was deathly silent. The war goddesses hovered a few thousand meters above the ground. Andrea and her companions looked at the scene in bewilderment. They could not understand the art of politics in the mortal world. Let her be. Mortals need these methods to deal with relationships between different classes. I know what you're thinking, but girls, it's not the time for you to interfere. Be a little more reserved. You're all ladies, Fuchsia said in a cold voice. They exchanged glances. The mortals had truly turned politics into an art. It was elegant, nimble, and ruthless. Although it left many wise men exhausted, it was still a huge step forward in the history of civilization. At the very least, it was a step away from bloody barbarism. The losers did not have to worry about being beheaded or sacrificed alive, and their families would not be enslaved. On the surface, it was warm and affectionate, forming a kind of game rule that everyone had agreed upon. In the hands of a true genius, it was exquisite like a work of art. His Majesty the Undead Emperor was clearly one of the best. Brando knew this very well. In history, this emperor started from a humble background. She used a mercury staff to ascend to the throne of the empire. Before she became famous, no one knew her origins or where she came from. But with the support of the vampire nobles, even though their support was not firm in the beginning and was filled with two-faced opportunism, she managed to unify the eastern part of the Sea of the Dead Moon in a short 7 years. She tied the 14 dark nobles together and established the Land of Eternal Death and Madara's court. After gaining her own foundation, the queen became unstoppable. She quickly gained the support and recognition of the Dying Moon Temple and was crowned as the Queen of the Silent Death Valley. Then, she used the name of the temple to start the First War of the Black Rose. This war was no doubt a stroke of genius. It not only diverted the hatred between the undead lords of Madara from the 7 years of civil war, but also gave the undead emperor a perfect opportunity to eliminate her opponents. In fact, the so-called First War of the Black Roses was actually a war to eliminate her opponents. Cabias, and later the Blood Staff, and other traditional undead lords were all killed in this war. What was even more commendable was that the long years of civil war allowed Madara to have an elite army at the beginning of the war. It allowed the undead emperor to achieve her goals and still win. This was very important. Because of this, the war could be transformed into dividends, allowing her followers to benefit from it. This further strengthened the emperor's position in this war. Madara was a special empire without citizens. A few undead lords ruled over the lives of tens of millions of low-level undead. The low-level undead had no intelligence and no political demands. Because of this special reason, it had always been difficult to form a true centralized empire. But the emperor also had the Mercury Staff, and she was very good at using this. She asked the undead to pledge loyalty to the Mercury Staff and not to herself. She used religion as a bond to maintain the pride of the undead lords. She used the legend of the Mercury Staff and the rising of the dying moon to complete the awakening of the Roman Black Rose. This was actually a process of national awakening. And through this process, the emperor, who hid behind the scenes, could easily push the dying Moon Temple to the front and judge whether the undead lords obeyed her or not. This could be said to be the Otherworld's version of holding the Emperor to command the vassals, but the undead Emperor cleverly used the tradition of the Dark Kingdom to complete this process beautifully. Until around the year of the sparks in history, Madara had in fact completed the substantial unification of the undead lords. The tradition of the undead lords in the past was completely abolished, and the vigorous development of a new alchemy system also allowed the country to have a completely different way of organization from the past. From then on, it was the arrival of the Black Tide that frightened the whole continent. Her Majesty was undoubtedly an outstanding ruler. Even though she acted arbitrarily and was cold and heartless, she was the most precious treasure that the heavens had given to the dead Moon Empire. The rumors of Madara's gifted monarch were definitely not just a puppet with a mercury staff. Instead, it was the chosen monarch that Martha promised to the undead of Madara. In her era, she was far superior to her peers. The rejuvenated monarchs of Cruz and Fanzan were far inferior to her, not to mention Saint Tassol, who was bound by outdated dogma and could not move forward, and Erwin, who was not worth mentioning in the eyes of the giant Madara. Facing such an existence face to face, it was impossible for Brando not to have a little fear in his heart. Compared to her, the Silver Queen of Cruz was not much different from the Silver Princess of 60 years ago. At most, she had the power of an empire. And this supreme person with a mercury staff, even if she was an ordinary person, was definitely the most dangerous kind of existence. But it was precisely because of this fear, as well as the familiarity of her origin and personality, that Brando found a trace of strangeness in the Queen's attitude. At this time, Delphian let go of the reins and came to Brando's side. She whispered a few words in his ear. Before Medisha could frown even more and stare at her with silver eyes, she straightened her body and walked away. Brando glanced at her. The words of the Kurlutzian Prime Minister's daughter coincided with the thoughts in his heart. He looked up at the sky, recalling some information about Lich Daelin in his mind. Daelin was one of the oldest undead lords in the Kingdom of the Dead Moon. In fact, he had seen the Mercury Staff of the previous generation, and had also seen Loki. He was also one of the 3 most powerful liches in Madara. It was for this reason that this fellow had always been disrespectful to Her Majesty the Queen. At the same time, he was also the commander of the Jackdaw fleet. This fleet was formed by a group of necromancers. It was born in the era before the Mercury Staff descended for the second time. Nominally, it belonged to the Dead Moon Temple, but in reality, it was under the command of an organization called the Undead Array. According to legend, the Undead Array was founded by Loki. Because Loki was the most outstanding necromancer in the Kingdom of the Dead Moon for thousands of years, this organization gathered most of the most powerful necromancers and liches in Madara. Its headquarters was in the west of the Sea of the Dead Moon. The necromancers who lived here had built countless towers on that land. Dark Moon sorcerers, in fact, referred to this group of people. Because of the power of the Undead Array, the Emperor didn't touch them until the end of the First Era, during the Year of the Dragon's Shadow. He only let the Lich of Balakirivo, who rose later, keep them in check. It wasn't until the end of the Long Night that Daelin and another Lich King died in the war against the Golden Sea. The Jackdaw fleet was destroyed, and the Undead Array was destroyed. Today, it seemed like this process was going to be brought forward. Brando had a hunch when he saw the time when the fleet arrived. Daelin obviously didn't care about the Emperor at all. If the Silver Elves hadn't kept their promise, Daelin's fleet wouldn't have come to clean up the mess, but to collect the Emperor's corpse. The Lich's intentions were clear. He was obviously fearless. In fact, the Emperor did have the ability to do so. If it wasn't for the accident in the final war, the Undead Array would have existed for a long, long time. At least until the middle of the Second Era, Madara wouldn't be able to truly unify. Although Brando suspected that the accident in the final war might not have been an accident. He only needed to look at the Emperor's current intentions to understand. The other party obviously wanted to borrow his hand to get rid of the unlucky Lich King. Brando remained silent. Of course, he didn't want to be used as a tool by the Emperor, but he obviously didn't have a choice. At least, if he wanted to break out, he had to ask the undead army's permission. However, he knew that even if he followed the Emperor's wishes, she might not let him go. It was more likely that she would use him to avenge Duke Dalin. After all, there was no alliance between them. It could only be said that the Emperor was scheming against him. However, he wasn't too worried. The Emperor with the Mercury staff had given him a big surprise, and he also left a surprise for her. After all, he knew her too well. As Erwin's main enemy, he had long been on guard against the Emperor's ruthlessness. What he was more confused about now was why the Emperor was so confident that he would follow her wishes. If he started with the undead army on the ground, the final result might not be something the undead of Madara could bear. Chapter 1305. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but glance at Bai's shadow. He thought to himself, and what exactly is this woman thinking? She seemed to be eager for him to fight with the Emperor of Madara. Although it was said that she wanted him to get the nature orb and the Mercury staff, Brando, who had been fooled many times, did not believe in this nonsense. What about the motive? He remembered the scene when he left the elemental barrier, where he saw Bai's soul fusing into the strange arrangement of the automatons floating in the sky dozens of kilometers away from Wonde. Bai's current state obviously had something to do with the situation at that time. Previously, when he obtained power from the elemental orb, he clearly felt that the authority came from the law of Tiamat and Martha. Therefore, he suspected that Bai had seized Martha's authority, because the strange automatons were obviously part of the law of Tiamat. But Haku denied it, although he wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. What? Bai noticed Brando's gaze, but did not care too much. Are you still suspicious of me? It's hard not to be suspicious, Brando said while paying attention to the movement of the undead. What made him feel a little strange was that although the undead army had surrounded them, they were not willing to make a move for a long time. This was somewhat different from the character of the Emperor that he was familiar with. In his impression, Bai should be a very decisive person. I can tell you the truth, Bai replied. But you have to answer a question of mine. It's not easy to confirm that the truth provided by the lady is the truth. Brando could not help but mock Bai when he recalled how Bai repeatedly lied to him in the elemental barrier. That's fine. I can first provide you with what I know. If you think that what I said is true, you have to answer my question. Conversely, you can ignore me, right? You're doing this again. Brando could not help but be angry when he recalled the experience in the elemental barrier. Fortunately, the two of them were communicating telepathically. Outsiders could only see the slight change in Brando's expression, but could not hear the content of their conversation. It's effective, isn't it? The choice is up to you, Bai replied without changing his expression. Brando gritted his teeth and didn't say anything. Anyway, he had made up his mind not to answer. No matter what he said, as long as this woman was telling the truth, then it was equivalent to him earning for free. Anyway, she had lied to him more than once in the elemental barrier, so they were even. He silently looked in the direction of the undead army. The Death Moon flag that represented His Majesty the Emperor had returned to the center of the army. If the undead were to make any moves, it should be within the next hour and a half. He extended his hand and summoned Sinna, the Frost Chant, into his hand. When it came to large-scale attacks, the only thing he could rely on was the Water Holy Sword. However, this thing would not be able to differentiate between friend and foe. Back at Fathom Harbor, if it were not for the fact that he was in the witch's dream, he would have blown up half of the harbor. The reason why he had the Silver Elves leave was firstly because he wasn't sure of the Emperor's intentions, and secondly, it was so that he could unleash his full potential. He had made up his mind to teach the other party a lesson so that it would be easier for the next negotiation. Insersta was still frowning at the side. Brando glanced at this guy and couldn't help but feel proud. He knew very well that this future star of Madara's family had a close relationship with the queen, so he deliberately mentioned the other party's previous promise so that he would have no time to think about other things. Otherwise, with this guy's intelligence, if he were to guess his thoughts and seize the opportunity to remind the emperor, then he would be completely done for. Fortunately, with the advantage of foresight, he once again took the initiative in front of this genius of Madara. Tarkus seemed to have noticed something, but interestingly, this vampire did not point it out. Bai saw that Brando didn't say anything, as if she didn't care what he was thinking. She said to herself, "My lord, do you want to know what that person's plan is?" Brando looked at Medicia's sister with a little disdain. "Her Majesty wants me to help her deal with the undead. Maybe she wants to kill two birds with one stone." "Miss Bai, you're not going to use this information to exchange with me, are you?" "Of course not, this is just a bonus." "Aren't you curious about what she's going to do?" "I can guess that she's the one who planted people in the undead fleet," Brando sneered, "but I won't let the Emperor down. I'll give her the biggest surprise." "Angering her won't do you any good, Count." "I have to remind you." Bai replied with a straight face. "Why?" "Because of the Mercury staff." Brando was silent for a moment and shook his head. "That's another matter. I don't plan to talk about it with her for the time being, but I will never show weakness in front of the Emperor. I know her style, or Erwin will never have a day of peace." "You know her very well," Bai said curiously. "You seem to be very interested in the undead." "There's an old saying in the Nine Phoenix," Brando replied. "You're saying that no one is allowed to sleep beside the bed?" "I've been to the Nine Phoenix before, so I know a little about the customs there. But as Erwin's subject, I think you're overreacting." "I don't want to talk about this, Miss Bai. You should be answering me, not the other way around, right?" Bai raised her head and looked at him. "Then what do you want to ask?" Brando was about to answer, but at that moment, flags were raised in the undead army, and the crystal towers for communication lit up again. A green net of light appeared in the darkness, and the undead army was immediately filled with dots of green light. This was undoubtedly the signal to attack. But to everyone's surprise, it wasn't the undead army on the ground that made the first move, but the jackdaw fleet in the sky. Suddenly, a flash of light flashed through the dark fleet. One of the battleships took the lead and fired its cannons. The flash of magic crossed a few thousand meters and arrived above Brendel and the others in an instant. However, the ray of light did not hit Brendel and the others. Instead, it was blocked by a transparent barrier far away from them. The barrier deformed slightly under the impact of the ray of light, but it returned to its original state in an instant. This time, it wasn't just Brando's people who were shocked. Even the undead lords were shocked. In their minds, Dai Lin, the Lich King, wasn't as loyal to the ruler with the Mercury staff as they thought. The undead lords weren't fools. They immediately looked at their cold and silent queen, and more or less had some guesses in their hearts. But to the person involved in this incident, the Lich King, Dai Lin, wasn't as angry as they thought. Although he was more or less unhappy that his subordinates acted without permission, the undead fleet wasn't his private property. As mentioned earlier, this fleet was formed by a group of necromancers and liches. Although Dai Lin was its commander in name, most of the time, the fleet did what they wanted. Rather than saying that this was a well-organized fleet, it was better to say that it was a large pirate fleet. So when the corvette opened fire, Dai Lin, who was observing the situation on the battlefield through the crystal ball, was a little unhappy. But he quickly suppressed his dissatisfaction and ordered the fleet to open fire. He could delay the time for the fleet to enter the battlefield, but he couldn't openly disobey the Mercury staff's orders. Although he was arrogant, he understood that the woman now had half of the forces in the Sea of the Dead Moon. She was afraid of the undead, but that didn't mean that she could ignore her dignity and be challenged. Dai Lin was demonstrating to the central government of the empire because of the blood staff, but he also understood that this demonstration couldn't be overdone. As for attacking a small group of humans, Dai Lin would never dream of how dangerous it would be. What kind of joke was that? That group of humans that he had surrounded had no more than 100 or so people at most. Even if every one of them was a peak law expert, they would not pose any threat to his fleet. No matter what, this was still a main force of the fleet. As for the possibility that the 100 or so people were all supreme beings, Dai Lin didn't even consider it. After all, he was a lich, not a brainless zombie. It had to be said that the Lich King had at least guessed the beginning, but it was a pity that he didn't guess the end. If the Lich King of Losart knew that he had entered the battlefield too late and missed out on something important, perhaps he would be more careful with his orders now. When the undead fleet was enveloped in a dazzling magic light, the woman with the mercury staff raised her head. Her pitch-black eyes happened to reflect this dazzling scene. She couldn't help but shake her head. Brando was no longer shaking his head. In fact, he was already cursing in his heart. It wasn't that he didn't expect the woman to plant people in the Jackdaw fleet. In fact, when the corvette opened fire, it was all within his calculations. That was why he had set up defenses early and blocked the magic attack dozens of meters away. But never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that the legendary Lich King would be so stupid. When he saw the entire Jackdaw fleet firing in unison, the Lich King felt like he was going to kill someone. No matter how scattered the Jackdaw fleet was, it was still a main force. When they started firing, Brando wasn't confident that he could take on an entire fleet while attacking the undead below. Right now, he only had one choice. He had to immediately attack the Jackdaw fleet and make them shut up. After all, if they didn't shut up, he would be fine, but the people around him would be. Chapter 1306. Brendel did not intend to make an example out of Dai Lin, but there was nothing he could do if Dai Lin wanted to die. He scolded him in his heart for being an idiot and raised the frost chant in his hand. After Cinna was recast in the shallow sea, the blade was longer than before, making it look like a thin sword. There was a wavy, cage-like gauntlet under the blade. Brando held it in his hand, and a sapphire embedded in the gauntlet emitted a faint blue light like water ripples. 3 light blue halos opened from the blade, 2 at the front and 1 at the back. The halos expanded to a radius of about 1 meter in an instant. They rotated as if they were 3 light gates. Marrow. The intertwined silver net in front of them was still resisting the streaks of flames that fell from the sky. The shells of the undead fleet fell on it like raindrops. But the moment Cinna shouted the activation spell, a blue beam of light suddenly appeared. It pierced through the net of light and went against the magic and artillery of the undead fleet, piercing into the dark night sky. The light was so bright that it seemed to be able to light up the dark night of the Finhodo Strait. It also lit up every pair of eyes on the battlefield. Countless people subconsciously turned to look at it. Adney and the knight only felt a strong wind blowing past their cheeks. The air and dust cloud raised by the blue beam of light blew everyone's hair up and brushed their cheeks. At that moment, time seemed to have stopped. Dai Lin was in the middle of a conversation with his apprentices, reminding them to be careful and not give the queen any information that could be used against her. If that was the case, she would, as always, viciously threaten these undead wizard apprentices with no status, saying that she would extract their souls and throw them into the crystal tower. But at that moment, someone seemed to be stunned and looked out of the porthole. The old lich turned around and almost bounced off his chair. The crystal ball was knocked off the table and rolled to the ground. In the depths of the old lich's dark eye sockets, the soul fire shrunk to a point. He slightly opened his jaw made of white bones, and did not even notice that the scepter that represented the fleet commander had loosened from between his pale fingers. If his eyeballs had not decayed, the bluest light would have been reflected in them. Frost Chant, Cinna. She was the legendary Winter Queen of the Jernords. Legend said that when she came, everything was frozen and the whole world was covered in snow. When she was angry, the world was turned into powder in the extreme cold. She was the goddess of the north wind, representing the harshness of winter and the respect of mortals to nature. The shallow sea's sacred sword was the manifestation of the goddess' will. Everything was dead, the winter of the world. Every holy sword had a unique skill, and Xena's skill, Heat Death, was enough to explain everything. It was the end of a universe. What shot out from Cinna was a blue beam of light formed by countless rays of light that surrounded each other. It rushed toward the fleet of the undead. Wherever it passed, even the air seemed to be frozen. The elements and laws that made up the air directly turned into powder and fell down. In this strait, before winter, there was heavy snow. The snowflakes were very fine, like gray dust, as if they were corpses. They were the corpses of laws and elements. The black magic and the cannonballs that the undead fleet shot out seemed to be weathered. When the beam of light passed between them, it turned into colorful dust and disappeared with the wind. On the undead fleet, the skeleton sailors were cutting the shackles on the limbs of the bone dragons so that they could take off from the deck. The ice dragons roared and spread their wings. The first batch had already left the ship and was circling in the sky, ready to dive down. But the beam of light passed between them. There was no frozen scene. More than 20 ice dragons exploded like pieces. Crystal dust swirled in the sky, forming a cloud of dust. However, it happened so fast that the sailors on the ship had no time to react. The beam of light had already pierced through the cloud of dust. It swept past the corvette a shadow boned first. The sailors on the deck were instantly vaporized, and the wooden planks were frozen and cracked. The 47-meter-long warship was cut into two halves. The wooden planks, the frozen sails, and the parts covered in frost fell from the sky like rain. The moment the beam of light passed through, the Jackdaw fleet lost a third of their warships, including their only first-class battleship, the treasure of the undead. It was also Dalen's ship. This Lameter Lich King was hit in the middle of the ship's deck. The beam of light pierced through its abdomen. It was split in two, and the rest turned into powder. Its skull flew out and hit a famous painting in the captain's cabin, then fell to the floor. The crimson light in its eye sockets flickered, then disappeared unwillingly. The Shallow Sea Sword. It really is you, the Queen of Madara clenched the mercury staff in her hand. Her tone was colder, and her attitude seemed to be more resolute. Dalen's ship turned into powder in midair. All the undead lords were shocked speechless. They had never seen such terrifying power. The pressure from the Shallow Sea Sword almost made them tremble from the depths of their souls. But Brando's attack was not over. Cinna's power shocked him. This was indeed the holy relic that sabers used to fight against an army. After it became complete, its power was close to the power that Milos had displayed. It was the power of God. But Brando felt that he was still unable to control this power. Even if Tiamat's authority was still on him, and he was still in the Sage Realm, it was still the same. He furrowed his brows and once again increased the output of his power. This time, Cinna no longer spewed out a beam of light, but a cone-shaped storm. After it crossed more than 10 miles, it directly enveloped the entire undead fleet. Half of the sky could be said to be filled with azure brilliance. A light flashed in the eyes of the Queen of Madara. She wanted to use Brando to kill Dalen, but this did not mean that she would allow Brando to destroy the undead fleet. It was already the wealth of the Empire. She did not even think about it and raised the mercury staff in her hand. It was the master of the Dark Will. It was often said that the Mercury staff could open the door to the underworld. But in his previous life, Brando rarely saw the Queen of Madara display the true power of the Mercury staff, even in front of the Madara players. She was a skillful ruler, but there was little information about her being a powerful necromancer. Of course, Brando guessed that her strength would not be that low. She should at least be in the Supreme Realm. After all, Madara was not an empire with a clear heritage like Cruz, and there was also the Holy Cathedral backing the throne. In this chaotic world, the only thing one could rely on was one's own strength. The facts proved his guess. When the woman raised the Mercury staff in her hand, he felt that he had lost contact with the prime material plane. To be more precise, he felt that he had arrived in a completely dark world. He was only stunned for a moment before he realized where he was. This was the Sea of Magic. Although there was nothing around him, he could feel the surging magic power. It was just that this power was filled with negative emotions such as malice, coldness, and frenzy. In this world, only one kind of power had such attributes, and that was the dark magic. It was also the predecessor of the dark element. Brando raised his head and saw Her Majesty not far in front of him. She was holding the Mercury staff, and the aura of power overflowing from her body was at the peak of the Supreme Realm. But this made him feel a little strange. Her Majesty the Queen should have understood that at this moment, his power was already at the level of a sage, not to mention that he also had a great killing machine like Cinna. She had decisively attacked him, and her backup plan was to pull him into this world created by the Mercury staff to fight him one-on-one. This was not very wise, was it? And it was not in line with her personality. But Brando immediately understood that he was wrong. He saw that the Supreme One of Madara only looked at him coldly, and her wavy black hair moved without wind. He was shocked to find that she was absorbing the majestic magic in the surrounding sea of magic. Absorbing the dark magic. Brando almost thought that he had sensed wrongly. Even a witch would not dare to use the dark magic directly, unless she wanted to immediately become a lunatic. But it turned out that Her Majesty did not become a lunatic, and there was a faint trace of gold in her black eyes. Her strength rose all the way from the peak of the Supreme Realm, and in the blink of an eye, she had crossed the threshold of the sage. But this was not the end. Brando clearly felt that her blood and aura were purifying, all the way from iron, silver, and all the way to gold before it stopped. A god. Brando was completely stunned. For the first time in this world, he felt that everything he was familiar with had fallen into an unreasonable state, as if his original worldview had collapsed. He had never heard of anyone who could directly absorb the dark magic for their own use. Of course, excluding the bastards under Dusk, if all mortals had such power, then they would not have to fight against Dusk. Dusk itself was already a part of the whole world. What was this woman? Or was this the power of the Mercury staff? But Brando immediately shook his head and subconsciously rejected this guess. The Mercury staff itself was only a part of the incomplete Holy Sword Judgment. Even the Black Pearl and Holy Sword Judgment did not have such power, let alone the Mercury staff. Chapter 1307. Brando believed that the Mercury staff only opened the door to this world. This kind of power was similar to the extreme planes, but the power of the Supreme Realm was a simulation of the law, while the power of the Mercury staff directly projected the sea of magic into the prime material plane. Compared to the level of the law, the latter was obviously higher. As for the absorption of the dark magic, it was obviously the power of this woman herself. But why did she have such power? Brando frowned, and suddenly felt a little tricky. What was the concept of a golden body? It was definitely not something he could figure out. When he was at his strongest in history, he was just a pseudo-silver great warrior. He was not even worth a finger in front of the Dragon King, Oenlos. And now, Her Majesty the Emperor of Madara had the power of Oenlos. No wonder the other party was so fearless. That was not easy to deal with. But at this time, a flash of lightning suddenly flashed in Brando's mind. He suddenly remembered that there was someone who could directly absorb the dark magic for her own use, the legendary 13th Moon Witch, the Witch of the Black Moon. Many people in history believe that the 13th moon did not exist, so its witch should also not exist. But there was also a saying that the Witch of the Black Moon was the witch with the most special inheritance. She was the harbinger, the one who brought about the destruction of the world. She was a witch and had the bloodline of the twilight, so she could directly use the dark magic. This news was not very reliable in his previous life, but in this life, Brando had already known the existence of the Witch of the Black Moon, so he subconsciously blurted out, "You are a Witch of the Black Moon. Her Majesty the Emperor of Madara is a witch." The woman's face showed some surprise for the first time, but she did not answer, and the look on her face quickly became cold again. It was just a momentary change of expression. In this world where everything was quiet and the whole world was dark, and only the two of them existed in this world, it was really difficult to escape Brando's observation. "What is your real name, Your Majesty?" Every witch had a real name, just like Baba Shah and Sugarpot. They were good at disguising themselves, but in front of the people they were loyal to, they often showed their real names. Of course, Brando did not expect any loyalty, but he knew that the other party would not refuse to answer his question. This was because he possessed the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Sure enough, the Queen frowned, but she still spoke. However, the words that came out of her mouth left Brando dumbfounded. "Don't think that I will do anything just because you obtained a part of my father's inheritance. My father's inheritance has no binding effect on the 13th moon, and the Dark Dragon isn't my master. The witches of the Black Moon are the most unique existences in this world. I'm only here to die." However, she raised her head and looked at Brando as she replied, "But there's nothing wrong with telling you my name. My real name is Sophia. You are Odin's daughter." "Why?" "But..." Brando suddenly understood. As the true descendant of Odin and the Witch Empress, where did the other party's identity as a Black Moon Witch come from? The witch lineage originally existed by stealing the power of dusk. It was said that the first generation of witches was created by the bloodline of dusk. It was not strange that the Witch Empress and her descendants had the bloodline of the Dusk Dragon. However, what made him feel strange was why the Witch Empress would give her inheritance to the Roman and give the inheritance of the Black Moon to her daughter. Logically speaking, shouldn't it be the other way around? Moreover, the name Sophie Yuya made him slightly stunned. He felt that he had heard this name somewhere before. "You look very strange. Your little lover and I are on opposite sides. I don't have any blood relations with her, but in theory, she should call me sister." "Wait, in theory, the Romans should be older than you, right?" "Shut up." The Queen replied indifferently, "I shouldn't have said so much to a dead person, but seeing that you have my father's inheritance, I reluctantly let you die with understanding. Martha, Ekis, and the witches have already agreed on everything. Do you think you are the destined one? But there is not only one king in this world." As she spoke, several pairs of light wings appeared behind her. They were exactly the same as Brando's own light wings, but the color was completely opposite. The light wings behind the Queen were actually pitch black. Only one person can decide the fate of this world. "We don't have much time left. She sent you to me for nothing. You don't have to blame her. That was my order. That woman is really up to no good." Brando couldn't help but curse. "Are you going to kill me?" he asked. "You can kill me too." The Queen replied, "If you can do it, I know you have the Halran Gaia, the blade of golden flames, the shallow sea sword, and even the approval of judgment. If you think you can do it, you can try." Brando couldn't help but curse in his heart. It would be strange if he could do it. Not to mention that he now had the power of several holy swords, even if it was doubled, so what? He now had the power of the sage domain, and this queen was obviously in existence with a golden body. How could he fight? He saw the woman raise the mercury staff in her hand and immediately shouted, "Wait! Are you trying to stall for time?" "No, I have a question. You said that only one person can decide the fate of the world." As Brando asked this question, his mind was spinning rapidly. He was not a fool. He knew that this queen's power obviously couldn't last forever. Otherwise, why would she need to use tricks in history? She could suppress all the voices of opposition in the Dead Moon Empire with her power alone. In the face of absolute power, tricks were just a joke. But she didn't. In fact, not only did this queen not do that in history, she even rarely displayed such power in front of people. At least, she didn't show it in front of living people, nor did she show it in front of players. Otherwise, there would be news about it. This meant that there was a limit to her power. But he still hadn't found out where this limit was, so he still needed time. That was why he asked this question without thinking. The queen glanced at him and replied without changing her expression, "The person who obtains the key can decide the fate of this world." "Are you immortal, Your Majesty?" Brando saw her expression and his heart sank. He knew that this queen was also a genius, so it was unlikely that she didn't see his plan to stall for time. But she was so calm that it could only mean that her power didn't seem to have a time limit in this world. Then he could only start from another angle. That would be even more troublesome. "Mortal." "Martha gave power to the mortals," Brando replied casually. "But in the end, it's still up to existences like us to decide the fate of the world. What's the difference between this and when the Truth Parliament still existed?" He paused and continued, "According to the Bugas, the power level of order that we represent is far higher than the world itself. As long as this order of the past exists, the war with the Twilight will never stop. What can we do? Just like the past. But the power of mortals is declining, and one day, we will even lose our inheritance. Is this the so-called age of mortals?" The queen sneered. "Do you really believe in the age of mortals?" "What do you mean?" Brando frowned, even his thoughts were interrupted. "That's just a complete lie. Do you really believe that the gods have left this world?" She looked at Brando with her black eyes, full of contempt. "No, they just lost their power, or died. Martha can't do anything about it. Otherwise, why do you think she made such an agreement with Ekis?" "What agreement?" Brendel's heart was filled with shock. "You don't know." The queen frowned, as if hesitating to speak, but she finally replied, "Martha promised Ekis that as long as she betrayed the Twilight, she would be given enough authority to become the ruler of Tiamta. In other words, she would replace Martha as the new king of the gods in this world." "That's impossible." "Nothing is impossible. Lady Martha has also lost her power. She has to replace Ekis. Ekis is sleeping in this world to avoid the eyes and ears of the Twilight Dragon and accept the transformation of the law of Tiamat. She wants to become the ruler of this world, so naturally, she can give up everything. But also seized this opportunity to seize the authority of the law of Tiamat. Speaking of which, I have to thank you for bringing her to that place. Although I don't understand what she's planning to do, the price I gave her is very simple, and that is to bring you here." Brando suppressed the shock in his heart and asked with difficulty, "So, the so-called age of mortals is actually a lie to cover up the replacement of the old and new worlds? You can understand it that way. What about you? What is your purpose, Your Majesty?" "Me?" The queen replied, "Of course, to become the ruler of the world. I have the talent laurel that Ekis, the new Martha, has given me. I have the blessings of the 7 holy swords. I will become the true ruler of the next era. Wherever I look, it will be the territory of my kingdom." Brando silently closed his eyes. He gently shook his head. On the battlefield of Fenhodos, Bai's shadow was looking up. Her eyes reflected the shining river of stars in the night sky. "Sister, what did you do to Sir Monarch?" Medusa asked coldly from not too far away from her. The eldest princess of the Silver Elves turned around and glanced at her younger sister. "You don't understand, Medusa," she replied faintly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Sometimes, I think that maybe it would be better for you if I didn't make this choice. Medusa, tell me, am I right or am I wrong?" Chapter 1308. The dark world was silent. The queen noticed Brando's movements and said, "What, you don't believe me?" Brando didn't answer. The memory in his heart flashed one by one. It was the most flawless light in the darkness, as pure as fire, as if it could contain everything. The gentle voice spoke so, it was enough to warm people's hearts. "Child, I will give you wings of light, so that you can be king. One day, I will be honored because of you, but how can I honor you, mother?" Brando raised his head and opened his eyes. The rainbow ring in his pupils was completely covered by a layer of light golden light, shining in the darkness. In the depths of his eyes, there seemed to be a bright flame burning. Why did the wound exist? Who gave the world the first ray of light? She was the mother of all living things, giving the world everything it should have: life, wisdom, civilization, and kindness. She had shown her children a path of incomparable brilliance. For thousands of years, countless people had been blessed and cared for by her. Even though they had failed time and time again, what shone like the spear of the azure night was their ideals and hope. Ideals and hope, they were only honored because of their tenacity and unyielding. We give her the honor. Because one day, children will leave their mother's arms. They will grow up and be independent. They will take the crown from their mother's hands and become the masters of the world. That day. Only then could it be called honor. This was the dream of mortals. But it was also the dream of Martha. Brando shook his head. How could he be shaken? The spears of the Curluts still shone brightly, and the people of Aween gradually regained their faith. The undead fought side by side with their ancestors on this land, and after 1,000 years, the war song of the Silver Elves once again reverberated across this land. No one gave up their faith. The fire of civilization was not extinguished because of this. "Your Majesty, why do you have to lie?" He sighed softly. The queen with the mercury staff was stunned. She looked at the man with a strange look. There was pity and disappointment in her eyes, but there was also a trace of appreciation. Then it turned into a distant look. "Do you really think so?" "Actually, I only have one question. How did the fire of the gods extinguish?" The queen remained silent. There was silence in the darkness. No one could answer this question, and no one would answer this question, because the answer was formless and naturally echoed in this dark world. They created this world and gave it everything. One day, they left. But hope was passed down from generation to generation. After 6 eras, they became the proudest children of the gods. Their older brothers, the Golden Sages and the Silver Guardians, gave everything to them. They were the last generation of this world, the Iron People. And that was where its hope lay. Then what is the age of mortals? Perhaps he still couldn't see the road ahead, but at least he had an answer in his heart. Brando believed that this was his own heart, and also everything that Martha had given him. One day, he might get the ultimate answer. But before that, at least he didn't have to wonder anymore. He looked at the queen in front of him and suddenly felt grateful. The questions that had been buried in his heart disappeared without a trace. A sword appeared behind Brendel's back. Like the rising sun, the sword was burning with raging flames, and the golden veins climbed up along the dark blade. That was an unyielding resistance, the origin of the history of the Erewhon and Cruz people. Then there were 4 swords that appeared one after another. The last one was the Judgment. When the dark holy sword appeared behind Brando, it immediately summoned the Mercury staff. The queen lowered her head and looked at the restless Mercury staff in her hand with a complicated expression. I didn't completely lie to you, the queen sighed. Unfortunately, I hope you won't regret your choice at this moment in the future. But I'm curious, I thought I was that person. Brando stared at her. I once met someone, she was more determined than you, her thoughts were noble, but she fell because of it. But in your eyes, I don't see a trace of madness. Hearing this, the queen's dark eyes flashed, and she gently put down the Mercury staff in her hand. You said that I'm not suitable for acting, and it seems that you're right. But as the blessed of the Black Moon, you must abandon your emotions, or the dark emotions will take advantage of it. Are you really the Witch of the 13th Moon? The queen nodded, except for the last words, I didn't lie to you too much. In fact, I really wanted to kill you, because I wanted to fulfill my father's wish. Are you talking about Odin? She shook her head as if unwilling to talk about it. You were talking about the Silver Queen, right? I'm sorry about her death, Gwendolyn was too extreme, and she paid the price for it. Brando was a little surprised. He already knew that the Dragon Queen and Fuchsia were related by blood, and Fuchsia and Odin were lovers. Speaking of which, Gwendolyn was really the queen's sister. But what the hell? He felt that everything was a mess. The queen raised the Mercury staff in her hand. This is everything you want. Loki's staff is the projection of dark magic in the present world. It is the reflection of negative emotions in people's hearts, but a real world cannot be without a dark side. Good and evil, light and darkness, they are all part of it. Annihilation and the value of its existence is to tell the world that our values are diverse. They argue with each other endlessly, but only then can we find the most correct path. Brando looked around, taking in the whole dark world. Although he had expected it, he still understood at this moment, so, all of this is an illusion created by the Mercury staff, and this is its power. The queen shook her head, it is not an illusion, but what you are most afraid to see in your heart, and the darkest side of your heart. If you don't see your heart clearly and examine your weakness, you will be swallowed up by arrogance and darkness. This is the meaning of Loki's staff. When she finished her sentence, Yi Zichen nodded. The dark world around them seemed to become brighter. Although it was still blurry, at least the darkness had disintegrated into fragments and was gradually fading. The queen's power was also rapidly weakening, from the peak of the golden body to the level of the middle of the supreme realm. Everything before was like a dream. But her ultimate power did not disperse, still isolating the two of them from the main material plane. Brando knew that this was the time she left for him. He asked, Ekis really wants to become Martha. He remembered the conversation between Timmy's and Ko Hua outside the elemental barrier, which seemed to have vaguely mentioned this matter. This is true, but it is not without restrictions for her. Lady Martha has already arranged everything, and the witches are only a part of this plan. The queen replied, but you don't need to know this, I only hope that you can stick to your own choice. Not everyone can take something from me, but this is the will of the Mercury staff, and I hope that you can go further. What do you mean? Brando was slightly stunned. But he saw that the queen's expression had returned to coldness, and she said coldly, before taking this step, I have one last question. Brando, do you understand the responsibility that your choice represents? I don't quite understand. The queen looked at him and silently said something, but her voice was very soft. She let go of her hand, and the Mercury staff flew out of her hand, drawing an arc as it flew towards him. Brando vaguely heard the sentence, I hope you don't regret it, then he stretched out his hand and took the Mercury staff. The world seemed to be stretched at that moment, and the colorful light rapidly faded from all directions. When the colors faded, it was a dark night, Dai Lin's warship that had turned into powder and fell from the sky, the black undead army, Bai with a complicated expression and the angry elven princess, as well as Adney and her knight. They were all back in his field of vision. The only difference was, he held the Mercury staff in his hand. Time froze here. In the dark space, hundreds of billions of dark golden constructs were suspended. They crisscrossed with each other, forming a huge net that densely covered the sky of Wonde. This was a silent and completely quiet world. Above the atmosphere that emitted fluorescent light, in the void, some crystal fragments would occasionally float past. Streaks of white light flashed past the constructs, and when they continued to brighten, they formed several light belts that were thousands of miles long. A pair of quiet eyes stared at the light belts. Two other voices were arguing in her ears. One of the voices belonged to a giant wolf. It stood majestically in the void, with the world wall that covered the entire sky as the background. Its silver eyes coldly stared at Bai, who was suspended in front of it. The small elf was not even as big as the tip of its nose. "Which, you brought me here from the loop of trade winds just to buy time?" Ekis asked. Sophie answered calmly. "Ekis, you weren't so impatient in the past." "This isn't impatience, it's uneasiness." Ekis shook his head. "The more you understand, the more afraid you will be of this world. I don't know what you're thinking, but unlike you, I don't believe in luck." "That's not luck," Bai suddenly said. "Ekis, are you going to break your promise?" Chapter 1309. After Haku spoke, there was a long period of silence in the empty space. After a long while, the silver wolf raised her head again. She looked at the silhouette of the silver elf elder princess with an indifferent gaze. The latter's will permeated the entire space, but she did not care. "Little one, that's the rule of your game." Ekis shook his head. His silver mane swayed gently. "Have you seen the ultimate mystery of the universe? Compared to all the truths in this world, your lives are too short. It's as if in a moment of my thought, you have already declined generation after generation." After saying that, the elegant creature raised her head proudly. "So, with your short lives, you can't understand its meaning. It's a moment of the universe, but it's also the eternity of all things. Its birth is older than everything you know, even before the birth of consciousness and the universe itself. It doesn't bring destruction, but new life. I've seen many people struggling to survive until now, but the end result is the same. Everyone knows how powerful it is. But in the end, you still betrayed it, didn't you?" Haku sneered. "That's the charm of all of this." Ekis's eyes flashed with a gentle light. "Birth and destruction are never constant. Because your vision is too short-sighted, you can only see the moment in front of you. The crystallizers and the no race, the locusts and my people are just the will that it produced in a moment. Just like the dreams of mortals, we're just a part of this world, and it's full of variables. Your war, my betrayal, it doesn't hurt at all. Your resistance is just like a part of this world. Can you hurt time itself? No. Whether you do evil or good, whether you live or die, the river of time will always move forward. Even if all things cease to exist, time will still flow. That's the great power." Haku frowned. "I hate your nihilistic thinking. As I said, this isn't nothingness. It's only because your lives are too short that you feel this kind of sorrow. In fact, even your short lives and some of your laughable actions are meaningful in my eyes." "Even to it, it is meaningful," replied Ekis. "It is only that you and I that have a different definition of the meaning. Existence is meaning," Sophie, who had been quietly watching Wonde, suddenly said. She turned her head. The witch's face was completely different from the Queen of Madara, but her eyes were similar. They were both indifferent and quiet. "There's no need to argue. What do you want? Authority, Ekis replied. I will immediately reactivate this world. This is your only chance. In the next era, with the help of the new gods, you will obtain even more opportunities. But this time, it's too late. When it descends, you will no longer have the slightest chance of victory. That's impossible. Bai rejected flatly. That's possible, replied Sophie quietly. I agree to your request. Your Majesty. Haku turned his head and looked at her. 3 existences floated in the void. 2 people and a wolf. The gods and the gods, in the past and the future, have always controlled the fate of this world. There is no difference, replied Sophie. But she is Akis, the new god of Wound. So what? She turned her head and looked at Haku's shadow. It is the world that chooses its fate, not us who decides the future of the mortals. This is not charity, Haku. Very few people understood what had happened in the instant before that. But at least they could be sure that the Queen of the Undead opened the extreme plane and pulled Brando in. Although it only lasted for a few seconds, the extreme plane disappeared in a few seconds, and both of them returned to the world unscathed. Brando raised his hand high, still maintaining the posture of taking the Mercury staff from the air. The restless Insursta was the first to see this scene. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he almost cried out involuntarily. But although he did not shout out in the end, his actions inevitably attracted the attention of others. Adney and a few of the 9 phoenixes were fine, but Metasha, Blank, and Delphian were stunned at the first moment. They looked at the Mercury staff in Brando's hand with a look of extreme disbelief. In fact, Brando himself was a little dumbfounded. He did not expect that the Queen would disperse the extreme plane in such a situation. What was she trying to do? The commotion at the front quickly spread to the liches and liches behind the undead army. When the apprentice necromancers saw the Mercury staff in Brando's hand, they all looked back with an expression of disbelief. The undead lords also turned their heads one by one. Their gazes were all gathered in the direction of Her Majesty the Queen. Almost no one dared to believe that the Mercury staff would be lost because of this. They thought that it was nothing more than a trick played by humans, but this trick was too absurd, so absurd that it could be seen through with a poke. But the question was, how could there be such a stupid person who would think of playing such a trick in front of so many people? In their minds, these humans were clearly not such stupid people. The undead lords were actually a little uncertain. And when they saw that Her Majesty the Queen's hand was empty, this kind of panic spread uncontrollably. Your Majesty, Isaac's face was pale, so pale that one could tell at a glance that he was a necromancer. Large beads of sweat seeped out of his forehead, and he stuttered as he asked, so nervous that it was as if he would suddenly die from arrhythmia in the next moment. But the Queen did not answer him. Her face was full of shock, and she trembled as she looked at Brando, as if something unbelievable had happened. Brando saw this woman's expression from afar, and couldn't help but curse in his heart. What happened to saying that I'm not suitable for acting? What happened to the witches of the Black Moon having to abandon all emotions? What happened to the basic trust between humans? Well, he meant the basic trust between humans and the undead. Can't you just play around like this? He couldn't help but call himself an idiot in his heart. He clearly knew that she was a famous movie queen in history, and the best actress at the Oscars, but he actually believed her when she said that. What was stupidity? This was stupidity. But what Brando didn't understand the most was what this woman was after. If she wanted to give him the Mercury staff and continue to maintain her ruling position, then the best choice would be to choose a private transaction, and then create a fake that could be passed off as the real thing. Anyway, no one would really come to verify the authenticity of the Mercury staff. However, the fact that she had thrown the Mercury staff to him and put on such a pose made him feel a little puzzled. If she said that it was to frame him, the price she had to pay was a little too high. Moreover, it would affect her own prestige, which was purely superfluous. But other than that, he couldn't think of any other reason. Unless this queen was a two-faced person, and simply wanted to toy with him. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but the more Brando thought about it, the more likely it was. He didn't have time to think about this question, but he heard the queen shout, "Catch him, the Mercury staff is on his scalp." Fuck. The undead army was in chaos in an instant. It was definitely not because they were mobilized, but because they were in a real mess. What did the Mercury staff mean to Madara? Throne? Power? Or was it a supreme status? Brando didn't know. But at least he understood that it was the highest belief and spiritual sustenance of the entire Dead Moon Empire. So every undead on the front line went completely crazy. As long as they had the slightest bit of intelligence, they wouldn't let the Mercury staff fall into the hands of a human. Without waiting for the undead lords behind to give orders, the undead wizard apprentices, liches, and liches on the front line had already screamed out orders. There was no coordination at all. All the undead just rushed over in a rush. Everyone was shocked, including Medisha and the always optimistic Miss Hippamra. To their small team, this undead army was definitely more terrifying than before. The key was that in the chaos, the undead were trampling on each other, let alone the enemies. How could they break through? But just when everyone was at their wits' end, a sacred sword burning with raging flames rose up from the chaos. Odorfice emitted such a bright light in the night that everyone couldn't help but raise their heads in that direction. The burning sacred light almost instantly burned the eyes of thousands of undead, piercing into their soul fire from the depths of their eye sockets. The long-awaited pain caused them to scream in pain, and some of the low-level undead even spontaneously combusted in an instant. The second sword to rise was the Shallow Sea Sword. The pale blue light flickered like ripples, spreading out in all directions. The undead that it touched were immediately frozen into ice cubes. Everything within 1,000 meters was sealed in ice. The third sword was the Halran Gaia. The fourth sword was the Firmament. When the fifth holy sword rose, Brendel suddenly felt a strong force in his hand, and the Mercury staff flew out of his hand. He looked up and saw a black shadow shooting towards the holy sword of annihilation. The fifth sword, in mid-air, Freya snorted, her golden eyes flashing slightly. 2 more. At this moment, boundless pressure descended from the sky. P.S. Begging for votes. Chapter 13:11. When the fifth sacred sword rose into the sky, the undead in the front row suddenly stopped. The necromancers and necromancers at the back were still anxiously urging the skeleton soldiers to move forward because their vision was blocked. The undead in the front and back rows collided with each other, and for a moment, the battlefield was in chaos. Until someone let out a hoarse scream. Sacred sword annihilation. Fall back, fall back. There was no need for the intelligent undead commanders to give orders. The tireless and fearless low-level undead seemed to be dominated by uneasiness for the first time. The soul fire in their sunken eye sockets flickered violently. The huge Crusader executioners at the front row had begun to fall back. These skeletal behemoths, which were 15 or 16 feet tall, unreasonably crashed into the group of skeleton soldiers and archers at the back row. Their huge shins were like battering rams, sweeping the fragile undead down. Then, the mid-level necromancers of Madara were horrified to find that they had lost contact with the low-level necromancers and the skeletons. They were shocked to see the sea of skeletons on the battlefield begin to retreat. The scene was even more terrifying and destructive than the scene of the human army retreating that they were familiar with. Because there were more of them. The necromancers and vampires at the back row were the first to be scattered. The noble vampire knights, who had to maintain their elegance on the battlefield, had no choice but to give up their elegance at this moment. They turned into bats and flew away from the battlefield. Although they could barely suppress the uneasiness and fear in their hearts, they could not find a leader in the chaos. They could only scatter and fly in the direction of Her Majesty. Then, the Black Knight was also affected. The noble dark nobles from the central region of the Sea of the Dying Moon were born in various noble families and territories. They were the proudest army of the undead army. Generally speaking, they were also the strongest in terms of combat power. They were not inferior to the liches and bone dragons. However, the Black Knight's role on the battlefield came from the charge of the Heavy Knights. Thanks to the characteristics of the undead, they were the only cavalry in the world that could charge like a wall. Hence, they were known as the Romans' Iron Curtain. But at this moment, this iron wall did not play any role in the face of thousands of retreating skeleton soldiers. Just like the human knights, these cold knights who cherished their feathers also made the right choice at the first moment. They waved the long sabers in their hands and slowly retreated with their retainers and attendants. When the Black Knight retreated, it basically announced the collapse of the undead line. North of the Strait of Finhodos, the commander of the Pale Knights, Duke Barbarossa, saw this scene from the periphery of the battlefield. His ghost-like face was full of worry. He looked up at the odd-shaped giant sword in the air. When the adjutant of the Necromancer Lord, who was also a high-grade necromancer, came to inquire him, the undead duke did not hesitate to order to retreat. Annihilation, the destruction of all things. Your Majesty. What should we do? Isaac's mouth was agape. Although he was a human, the muscles on his bald head were loose and pale. His eyes were sunken and his limbs were withered, making him look more like a skeleton than a skeleton. He did not expect the queen to answer his question. The Supreme One of Madara turned her head and glanced at him. He found that the cold eyes of the other party were shining with fanaticism. Your Majesty. Do you know how the Dark Prophecy described this scene? The queen smiled coldly. When Duke Balakarivo sent you here, did he tell you that you can never go back? Your Majesty, no. Isaac's eyes widened. He saw the queen put her hand on his chest and gently pushed him back. His body became light, and the scene in front of him quickly receded. The master of undead alchemy let out a scream and fell from the high platform. With a light crack, countless spears pierced through his body. Isaac jerked up like a dying fish. He opened his mouth, and black blood spurted out. Sophie looked coldly in this direction and turned around. No one on the battlefield noticed this scene. All the undead lords stared motionlessly at the holy sword destruction that rose slowly in the air. Although many of them had never heard of this holy sword, it was a natural feeling as if they were facing their natural enemy. Fear poured out from the depths of their hearts. The strong-willed liches were fine, but most of the undead lords who used to be warriors even collapsed to the ground. Then the Dark Knight began to retreat. The skeletal warhorses they were sitting on knelt on the ground one by one, throwing them out of the saddle. A few unlucky ones even broke their necks. Although it was not a big deal for the undead, it was enough to make the scene chaotic. The Lord of Darkness had descended. It would dominate everything. A circle of black ripples spread out from the holy sword destruction in all directions. The undead on the battlefield suddenly fell to the ground. Their bodies did not suffer any damage, but the soul fire in their eye sockets had long been extinguished. Tens of millions of soul fires floated up from the battlefield and flew towards the pitch-black holy sword in the air. The Pale poem described it like this: the beginning, a world born from thoughts, the beginning of everything, the world was in chaos, water and wind, fire and lightning surrounded everything. Then creatures were born from the water, multiplied on the earth, blessed by the wind, endowed with wisdom by fire. Martha said a name, Nana Inta. Light, darkness, wind, water, fire, earth, the 6 elements surrounded this world. The original laws of nature formed another 14,000 gods. Grasping all of this, it was done. Pale Poem, the Book of Beginnings. One of the gods was in charge of the kingdom of the dead at the end of all life. It was Hela, the god of the underworld. Legend had it that when Hela fell, the authority of the underworld was lost to the world. It was divided into 3 parts. The most important part, the Mercury staff, was lost on the earth and established an eternal kingdom. But in the legend passed down from generation to generation in Madara, Hela would eventually return and take back the authority of the underworld. When that day came, it would be the Sabbath of the undead's eternal rest. Now, the Lord of the Kingdom of the Dead had returned to the world. Almost all the undead felt the resurrection of the underworld dragon Hela at this moment. It was in the sky, and the 17 stars that made up it were shining brightly. Long before the year of the Lord, Chaos 327, this constellation had already collapsed in the void. And at this moment, in the dark purple sky of Fenhodos, it was side by side with the war dragon. In the sky 35 degrees north of Alphonse, the god of fury, it formed the shape of a black rose. The light of the 17 stars fell on Brando's body. 17 satellites, Hela is only a god with secondary authority. Why does it have its authority? Fuchsia looked up and muttered to herself. In the void outside the elemental boundary, 2 people and a wolf reached a final agreement. Hela is the daughter of Loki and Enboda. Her existence that day was part of the plan to tell the dead. The first generation of arbitrators planned these 17 satellites and designated its secondary authority because rebooting the world was never the first choice of the ancestors. Martha wants us to remember that it is always the last and most helpless way. Sophie looked at the fluorescent atmosphere and said quietly. Now the authority of the Ring of Nibelungen walks on the earth. He is the last king of this era, and you and he will be the 2 existences with the highest authority in this era, just like the first generation of ancestors and Martha. And now, you must decide the fate of this world together. Of course I understand. As if something had happened before, Ekis looked a little weak. His huge body became illusory and translucent like Haku's previous state. He will also understand this. The era of mortals can't be established in one era. At least we have learned enough lessons and experience this time. One day, maybe it will really succeed. She shook her head. Although I don't think so. You have to be firm in your beliefs, Ekis, Haku replied with a frown. It's Lady Martha, Sophie said quietly. I don't need you to tell me that. The moment I assimilated with it, I became one with the order of this world, Ekis replied proudly. This assimilation itself wasn't her replacing me, nor was it me replacing her. I know she left some tricks behind, but I won't bother about it. But you, little elf, what did you leave behind in Nucleus 14? Why can't I enter? Nucleus 14 is Helene's domain. It is the most mysterious domain in this world. Even Martha is not the ruler of all things. You are the one who created them, but you are not a dictator. Haku replied flatly. Sophie turned around and looked at her. I won't bother with you. At least you keep your word. I didn't expect you to admit it. Well, since we have reached an agreement, it's your turn to fulfill your promise. Haku said. Ekis narrowed her eyes and looked at the faintly glowing continent of Wonde. You still won't give up. What does this have to do with you? Is this how you treat the mother of all things, little elf? I will only admit it when you fulfill your promise. Ekis chuckled. She suddenly stood up, and her enormous body slowly stretched out in the void. She turned her head and silently glanced behind the realm crystal wall. Then, she raised her head. Chapter 13:12. At that moment, the giant wolf's silver fur fluttered without any wind. Woo woo, woo woo woo, she closed her throat and let out a distant howl. At that moment, it echoed in the sky of Wonde. On the battlefield of Erewhon, both sides of Winnomar stopped at the same time. The undead raised their heads and looked at the sunset sky. The necromancers ran to the center from all directions of the battlefield. The Red Knight Ladios looked at his army wizard in confusion, the lich from the south of the Sea of the Dead Moon who was in a daze. It's coming, what's coming? That legend, I don't understand, Your Excellency. Look, Hela's 17 stars. It's back, they're all back, Ladios frowned and raised his head. The battlefield was already in chaos. The wizard screamed and ran aimlessly to the communication crystal in the center of the battlefield. Their hysterical voices echoed throughout the battlefield. On the other side of the battlefield, Freya raised her head and asked her guards in shock, "Is that a wolf's cry?" "It seems so, madam, maybe it's the wolves in the direction of the Pine Mountains." "Don't worry about them. What's wrong with the undead? Maybe this is our chance." "Where's Lady Brunhilde? Is she here? I need the Valkyries to organize and launch an attack." "Madam, just now, Lady Brunhilde and the others have left the battlefield." "How? Why, did someone give them orders?" "I don't know, madam. They went east." "East, isn't that where the army of the Queen of Banshees is?" Freya's face showed an expression of disbelief. Crack. Sugar Jar looked at the broken honey jar on the ground in shock. Thick amber liquid seeped out from between the fragments of the jar. The bright liquid seemed to reflect the full moon. She raised her head and looked at the dark pine ceiling above her. Babasha trembled as she looked at this scene and muttered to herself behind her, "Don't worry. It's coming, it's coming. Do you hear that, my master?" If it was any other day, Sugar Pot might have reprimanded her servant, but at this moment, this little girl's face revealed a rare look of anxiety. The omen of calamity. Her heart began to beat violently. She suddenly turned around and rushed out of the house. Outside the room, the twin witches beside the Witch Queen were just about to push open the door when the three of them collided with each other. Ouch! The two little Lolas immediately cried out in pain. Ever since they left Rushta, they had always been at odds with Brando's witches. If it was in the past, they would have already fought with each other. But now, they didn't have time to express their dissatisfaction. One of the little Lolas got up and shouted at the sugar jar. "Do you have the man-devouring demonic book? Hurry up and take it out." Page 650. Another lowly added. Sugar Pot had already crawled up and quickly took down a dusty black book from the bookshelf. She swept the black cover with her hand, sweeping off a thick layer of dust. Then, she opened the book, and the rows of sharp teeth on the title page immediately retracted. The room was quiet, and only the sound of pages flipping could be heard. For a moment, dust flew everywhere, causing everyone to cough. But all of a sudden, the sugar jar stopped. Between the pages of the thick book in her hand, the words written on it were emitting a bright golden light. It was just a few short sentences. Above the Fenhodo Strait, a deep purple color was swallowing the last touch of golden red in the sky. The stars were like sand at the bottom of the sea, shining dazzlingly. The howling of wolves resounded through the sky. It seemed to come from all directions and lingered in everyone's heart for a long time. In the legends of the 10 cities, the wolves were the omen before the end of the world. They would always sweep across the land before the first snowstorm, tearing apart all the hope before the harsh winter. The howling of wolves was like a nightmare in the north wind. It was stationed in the depths of every veteran hunter's heart, making them tremble in the nightmare. But this time, they intimidated the undead of Madara. 11 girls appeared on the battlefield. No one even saw where they came from. Their long silver hair fluttered in the wind. They stretched their necks and howled on the rocks, responding to the call of their mothers. The wolves seemed to appear from the fog in all directions. They moved forward around the battlefield like waves. Then, it was the endless calamity of wolves. The dark nobles of Madara watched this scene without moving. The sea of undead that they were proud of. The army of the crystal cluster that they once regarded as a great enemy. But in front of this black tide, they were not worth mentioning. Those giant black wolves that were the size of hills slammed their claws on the ground. They retracted their claws and crossed with each other again. As they ran, they made thunderous sounds that fell on everyone's heart like raindrops. Even if their hearts had stopped beating, they could still feel the deep fear at this moment. A few eras ago, they had destroyed this world several times. The records of the calamity of wolves were recorded in the thick ancient books of Wone that were sealed under the dust of history. Between the lines, they were full of the aura of destruction and despair. And today, they came again. But this time, it was not the declaration of the end of the world. Dim Corfez stood on top of a high mound, her hands clenched tightly into fists. The beautiful white wolf beside her said softly, "Don't worry, I'm sorry. Sister, this is what Lord Milos told us, fate, but I hate all of this. I hate this world. I hate that man. Where's mother?" Humph! The black wolves, like a tide, surged past the high mound. They surrounded Brando as if they were guarding a high and mighty king. Their howls rose and fell one after another as they pounced in the direction of the undead. The Dark Monarch herds the wolves. Before the end of the world, disaster follows. In his eyes, there are no secrets in the world. Delphian read these words in a daze. The ancient words seemed to come true at this moment. Insursta looked at this scene in disbelief. No. He suddenly turned his head and said loudly to his colleagues in the language of the Nine Phoenix, "Tarkus, what are you hesitating for? The future that His Majesty promised us, has it come true?" "No, it hasn't. Tarkus, we must stop him. Madara must not fail." After that, he drew his sword and rushed toward Brando. His actions were so sudden that Medusa and Hippamela couldn't react in time. Although Phoenix understood the undead knight's words, she was standing too far away and couldn't make it in time. Insursta rushed to Brando's side in a stride. He raised his sword and stabbed at the latter. But Brando's mind was tied to the 5 rising holy swords at this moment. He did not completely lose consciousness. He only stretched out a finger and blocked Insursta's sword. A look of despair appeared on the latter's face. Brando looked down at him. "You have broken your promise and blasphemed the glory of the Dark Nobles. I don't care, Count. Kill me. For Madara, I will die without regrets." Insursta's face showed a determined look and said loudly. At this time, Medusa's spear arrived, and the tip of the spear was pointed at Insursta's back. Tarkus wanted to stop her, but was stopped in place by Hippamela's spell. "Don't, Insursta." Tarkus's face showed anxiety for the first time. "My lord, don't kill him." The Silver Elf Princess's spear stopped at Insursta's back. Because she saw Brando shaking his head at him. Insursta's face was pale. Of course, he knew that he had just walked around the door of death. The undead were not afraid of eternal death, but in the face of destruction, the first reaction of any intelligent being was instinctive resistance. Unless it was crazy. But Insursta was obviously not crazy. "Why don't you kill me?" he said in a hoarse voice. "Count, let me be buried with the Black Rose of Roman Tuo. You have a lot of talents under you. You don't need me. If I don't kill you, Madara will not be destroyed. You can still be loyal to your queen. Don't you see?" Brando turned to Tarkus and said, "Tarkus, take your friend down. He is a little irrational." Tarkus shook his head and bowed to thank Brando. He sighed and went forward to pull his colleague. "Tarkus, why, have you also betrayed the Empire? My friend, don't you understand? This is the will of Her Majesty. What? Brando shook his head. The Black Lord could be said to be the #1 genius of Madara in the future. His talent in battlefield command was unparalleled. He may be a little immature now, but in the future, he may surpass Medisha. He was not comparable to people like Erwin and the three heroes. But after all, no one was perfect. This somewhat unruly Madara general lacked a keen political sense and vision. Except for Tarkus, his relationship with almost everyone in Madara was not so harmonious. Perhaps it was because of this that the Supreme of Madara let him partner with Tarkus. As it turned out, these two were also the most perfect partners. And thinking of the Queen of Madara, Brando couldn't help but raise his head and look in that direction. In the center of the retreating undead army on the battlefield, Her Majesty and her guards still insisted on not retreating. Her guards were like reefs, standing in the middle of the battlefield. Thousands of meters away, Brando seemed to be able to see the dark eyes of the other party, silently looking in this direction. So what was the other party thinking? Her Majesty the Queen of Madara. He looked back. Bai's figure had long disappeared. Chapter 13:13. What is this place? The flames crackled as sparks danced in the air. The distorted heat wave blurred the scene in front of them. It was like a street. The street was not spacious, but it was paved with stone slabs. There were 2 trenches for carriages. On both sides of the street were 2 or 3-story tall brick buildings, but most of them were only left with their frames. From time to time, the sound of buildings collapsing could be heard. There were also sounds of fighting, screams of despair, begging, and cursing. The flames that reached the sky reflected a fiery red color on the horizon. Smoke and dust rose into the sky, forming thick black clouds. Is this Westminster? Braggs. Why is this happening? His mind was muddled as if there were countless voices lingering in his head. They seemed to be talking loudly, arguing with each other, whispering and chattering. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes it was a woman, sometimes it was an old man, sometimes it was a child. Shut up! Shut up! Tersh shook his head and shouted loudly. Sure enough, all the sounds stopped. He saw another scene. It was a dark and empty world, and there seemed to be solid ground beneath his feet. A group of people wearing white robes and emitting fluorescent light were walking forward. Those people had no faces or hair, and he seemed to be involuntarily following them. Tersh, Tersh. A ghostly voice called his name through the void of space. The voice reminded him of his own childhood in the countryside of Wynomar, when he had hidden in the stables, separated by a thin wooden wall, and the wet nurse had called his name. Then the door was violently flung open, and he saw the face that haunted his dreams, and that he least wished to recall, his nominal father, the Duke of Grenoires, who glared at him as coldly and angrily as he remembered it. That face quickly changed into his elder brother's look of contempt. I will kill you, Tersh. No! Tersh screamed in horror, but the voice quickly changed in his mind. It was the voice of his first woman, his maid. That poor woman had died in an epidemic, and he didn't have much memory of it. Tersh, Tersh. No, shut up, you damned ghosts, stay away from me. He moaned with a pale face. He retreated, and the scene in front of him blurred. The pale figures disappeared, and he saw a boundless plain. The ground was black, the sky was blood red, and the sound of killing filled his mind like a tide. Ah! Tersh screamed as he covered his ears. His eyes were wide open in agony as he stared at the scene in front of him. It was a tragic battle. Countless creatures and monsters that he couldn't name were fighting each other on the battlefield. The site of the battle seemed to be humans, but he had never seen such powerful humans. They could summon all kinds of weapons, and in an instant, they poured out doomsday-like power on the battlefield. They rained fire on the battlefield, and the monsters died in their hands. They then created a few bright suns between heaven and earth. The suns seemed to absorb all the light around them, turning the world into darkness. When they were born, all the monsters around them vaporized in an instant, turning into smoke and dust. They also dropped meteorites from above the clouds. The meteorites passed through the thick black clouds, leaving behind a few golden red lines that were perpendicular to the ground. Then, they caused a series of explosions and roars on the battlefield. But there were still too many monsters. As if there was no end to them. Burning crystal shards pierced through the sky and fell into the human camp, creating huge craters. Then, giant crystal monsters crawled out of the craters, easily killing the powerful humans. Then came the insects. Insects that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Countless insects died before they could even get close to the humans, turning into dust. But they were also pervasive. More and more insects landed on the human camp, and the powerful humans began to retreat after a short period of resistance. Terst saw a giant wolf as large as a hill slaughtering its way into the human camp. The humans' retreat quickly turned into collapse. A sense of despair enveloped his soul. It was as if he had some sort of blood connection with these powerful humans. When he saw them fall, he suddenly understood that this was the final battle of this world. They had lost. No, no. Terst muttered as he knelt on the ground, covering his face with his hands. He saw a group of silver-white monsters appearing on the horizon. There weren't many of them, but the humans couldn't do anything to them. They were like silver lines that pierced through the battlefield, causing the humans to fall one by one. A silver-white monster landed not far from him, then turned around and looked at him. Terst's eyes widened, his entire body trembling as he trembled. Don't kill me. A bright and snow-white blade was reflected in his eyes, plunging straight into his throat. No! Terst screamed in despair as he felt his throat turn cold. Everything in front of him quickly distorted and melted into the darkness. Plop! Plop! The sound of snow being squeezed together could be heard. A pair of moccasins that were tightly tied with leather ropes was trudging through the snow near Xena Forest. The owner of the boots suddenly stopped. The owner of the boots was dressed in a hunter's attire commonly seen in the Eagle Castle area. He had a thick jacket, tight leather pants, and deerskin gloves missing 2 fingers. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows on his back and a bunch of other things on his belt. There were even 2 animal traps hanging from his belt. He was about 67 years old, in the prime of his life at Wone's age. His skin was dark, and it was obvious that he was an experienced hunter who had spent a lot of time in the wilderness. The man had 2 hunting dogs on his leash. The dogs were sniffing around the ground, but the first snow of late autumn in the north interfered with their judgment, causing them to hesitate. After a while, one of the dogs raised its head and barked towards a direction in the forest. A lot of snowflakes fell from the trees. A group of riders came out from the forest behind the hunters. The leader of the group, an elderly knight, pulled on the reins and asked, "Did you find anything, Pierce?" "There's something in the forest, my lord." "Could it be a herd of deer?" "No, my lord, there's no trace of a herd of deer nearby." "Maybe it's a rabbit or some other small animal," a young knight said. "No, the dogs are very uneasy. Only bears in the forest can make them so uneasy." "But the bears are hibernating now, so you can't see them," Pierce said with certainty. "Maybe there's 1 or 2 that aren't so afraid of the cold. The snow isn't thick yet, so they have to hurry out and store food." Duke Hoffman waved his hand. "Believe in Pierce. He's the best hunter around here. Draw your swords. Boys, let's go in and take a look." No, my lord, let me go in and take a look. I'm familiar with the forest. If there's anything strange, I can at least send a message. Pierce replied in a deep voice. Duke Hoffman looked at the old hunter and nodded. The forest quickly became quiet. The young knight seemed a little nervous. There were many ancient legends about the forest. There was a forest with many old human faces carved in it. It was said that the person who carved them was once the owner of the forest. But these people had long been lost in the depths of the forest, leaving behind all kinds of mysterious sayings. Not only the humans, but the horses also seemed a little uneasy. The warhorses of the 10 cities area all came from Ice Bay, which was further north. They were cold-resistant, tall, and covered with hair. Wild horses fought with wolves all year round, so they were fierce, brave, and wild. But these Ice Bay horses were now snorting, and white mist with warmth came out of their nostrils, condensing around the cage. They used their hooves to scratch the ground, as if something in the forest made them very nervous. The knight comforted their companions, but Duke Hoffman's face was full of seriousness. According to the tradition of the Eagle Castle, the forest would be frozen after winter. It was said that the ancient spirits would appear in the depths of the forest to patrol and hunt. So no matter if it was farmers or hunters, they would not enter Xena Forest in winter, because it would offend the ancient spirits and bring about a curse. If not for the fact that he had no other choice, as the owner of this land, he would also not be willing to enter the forest in this season. He had been in charge of the Eagle Castle for 63 years. Including his long youth, he had lived here for almost a century. As an old man, he was very clear that these traditions and taboos could not be violated. But there was a reason for this. 2 days ago, a strange thing had happened in the forest, so he had no choice but to come here and investigate everything clearly. Speaking of which, this matter had to be told before the short summer in the 10 cities area ended. That was something that happened 3 months ago. The wild elves came across the sea, disembarked in the 10 cities area, and then went east, passing through more than half of the northern territory. One of them just happened to arrive at the Eagle Castle. Duke Hoffman had already received an order from the Holy Church, and understood that these elves would not stay in his territory for too long. As such, he allowed them to stay outside the far Eagle Castle for a while. As expected, around a week later, the elves left towards the east. After entering Xena Forest, they disappeared without a trace. East of Xena Forest, after passing through the Heather Hills, the only place to go was the endless Great Glacier. Before the year of the return of light, the pioneer knight from Fanzon expanded east along this road, and there they bumped into the border of the World of Order. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.